Welcome back, my friend. Settle into whatever chair or bed you're in tonight, because we're about to spend several unhurried hours somewhere far from where you are sitting right now. Tonight's destination is a wealthy household in Victorian England, and the woman whose day we are about to follow is not the woman you picture when someone says the words Victorian lady. Forget the still portrait, the folded hands, the faraway gaze out a rain-streaked window. That image is a finished product, a costume with the person removed from it. What we're going to do tonight is put the person back inside the costume and watch, hour by hour, what her day actually demanded of her. A day that began before sunrise, ran on an invisible schedule tighter than most modern executives keep, and required a kind of stamina that the soft lighting of a museum portrait could never hint at. If you enjoy this kind of slow, detailed wandering through the past, consider subscribing before we start. It helps more than you'd think, and it's the reason we get to keep doing this. And if you're comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like picturing it, someone in Ohio with the lights already off, someone in Manchester finishing a late shift, someone in Perth just starting their morning. Wherever you are, settle in. Let the room go quiet. We're going back to 1881. The city is London. The neighborhood is Belgravia, a district built specifically to house families exactly like the one we're about to enter, families with money that is comfortable rather than staggering, families whose respectability is real but requires constant, careful tending. The house is stucco-fronted, 4 stories above a basement kitchen the family upstairs rarely thinks about, with a black iron railing along the front steps that the housemaid polishes every second morning whether or not it needs it. It is not yet 7 o'clock. Fog sits low over the square outside, the gas lamps still lit, throwing a weak orange haze into the mist. A milk cart rattles somewhere 2 streets over. Inside, most of the house is still and dark. One room is not. We'll call the woman we're following tonight Margaret. She is 29 years old, married for 6 years to a man named Charles Whitfield, a solicitor whose practice has recently begun attracting clients considerably wealthier than the ones he started with. That shift from a comfortable but unremarkable practice to one edging toward real prestige has changed Margaret's life more than almost anything else that has happened to her as an adult, because in Victorian England, a husband's rising status is not simply enjoyed by his wife. It is administered by her. It becomes her job to make the household look like the kind of household a man on the rise ought to have, and that job, invisible, unpaid, and never once described using the word work, is what fills nearly every hour of the day we're about to spend with her. Margaret has 2 children, a daughter of 5 named Alice and a son of 2 named Edmund. She has a staff of 6. She has a dress allowance that would represent more than a year's wages for the housemaid who irons her petticoats. And she has, sitting closed on the small writing table by her window, a slim notebook in which every hour of today has already been accounted for before she has even opened her eyes. She's awake now, in fact, though the room is still dim. She has been awake for perhaps 10 minutes, lying still, doing what she does most mornings before ringing for her maid, running the day forward in her mind. Not from nerves exactly, though there's a thread of that too. More from a habit built over years of understanding that a day like today, which includes callers to receive, a charity subscription to finalize, a walk to the dressmaker, and a formal dinner tonight at the home of people whose good opinion genuinely matters to Charles's career, cannot survive improvisation. Everything has to click into the next thing. If one piece slips, the whole afternoon rearranges itself, and Margaret does not like rearranging. This, the quiet, private, unglamorous mental labor of scheduling, is where we should start correcting the popular picture of women like Margaret, because it's already wrong within the first 10 minutes of her day. We tend to imagine wealthy Victorian women waking whenever they liked, ringing a bell, and drifting into a morning of tea and needlework. The truth is closer to a person running a household the size of a small business while simultaneously performing, almost constantly, in a play where she is both leading actress and the only stage manager. And crucially, none of this counts as labor in the language of the period. The The great social fiction Margaret lives inside is that a woman of her station does not work. She simply exists gracefully, and that grace is meant to look effortless, a kind of ambient proof of her husband's success. The actual effort that produces the appearance of effortlessness is enormous and almost entirely erased from the record. Tonight, we're going to put it back. She rings for her maid at 6:20. The maid's name is Bridget, 22 years old, in service with the Whitfield household for just under 3 years. Bridget has a talent that wealthy Victorian households value more than nearly any other quality in a lady's maid. She anticipates. She already knows, without being told this morning, that tonight is a formal dinner, which means Margaret's hair will need building in 2 stages. A simpler daytime arrangement now, then something considerably more elaborate rebuilt from scratch before this evening. She has already pressed today's dress, a deep plum-colored wool that holds its shape well in photographs, though of course no one is using that word yet, with the kind of quiet richness that says comfortable rather than showing off. She has already laid out the dressing table exactly as Margaret prefers it, each brush and pin tray in its habitual place. The morning routine, start to finish, takes close to an hour and a half. It's worth walking through slowly because the details are where the real story lives. First, washing. There is no bathroom attached to Margaret's bedroom in 1881. The shared bathroom with its large copper tub sits at the end of the corridor, used twice weekly for a full bath that is itself a minor production. Hot water hauled up in heavy jugs by the housemaid, poured in stages, tested, topped up. On other mornings, Margaret washes at her own washstand, a porcelain basin filled by Bridget with warm water carried up from the kitchen range. Face, neck, arms, hands, all washed thoroughly with a mild rosewater soap, followed by a cool rinse Bridget insists keeps the complexion clear. An opinion Margaret has stopped questioning after 6 years of watching it prove correct. Then what we would call skincare. Though the Victorians wouldn't have used that phrase. A dab of cold cream, worked in and wiped away to draw out the grime the wash alone doesn't lift. A little glycerin and rosewater patted onto cheeks still slightly pink from the cool rinse. If her skin looks dull, which after a poor night's sleep it sometimes does, Bridget might smooth on the faintest trace of rice powder, so light it disappears the instant it's applied. Margaret does not think of this as cosmetics. Respectable women do not wear cosmetics. The social line here is absolute, and the fact that the line is largely fictional doesn't make it any less real in its consequences. This is simply grooming. The distinction matters enormously to how Margaret understands herself. Then the hair, which justifies most of that 90 minutes on its own. Margaret's hair is dark blonde, thick, falling well past her shoulders when loose, braided overnight to keep it from tangling. Bridget unpins it, unwinds the braid, and works through it with long, unhurried strokes of a boar bristle brush she has owned since her first position and treats with something close to reverence. The brushing does several things at once. It carries the scalp's natural oil down toward the drier ends, clears away the last of last night's pomade, and in the beauty thinking of the period, stimulates healthy growth. It also, practically, readies the hair for the architecture about to be built on top of it. The fashionable shape for a married woman of Margaret's age in 1881 is a low chignon at the back of the head with a soft fringe framing the forehead. Elegant, controlled, and considerably harder to construct than it looks. Bridget has spent years learning the technique, and she works with a combination of Margaret's own hair and small false hairpieces, carefully matched in color, pinned in at the crown to give the volume that Margaret's natural hair, thick as it is, still can't quite supply on its own. The pieces are pinned in so cleanly that no one at tonight's dinner will have any idea they exist. What they'll see is simply a woman whose hair looks correct, which in 1881 means full, glossy, and perfectly under control. While Bridget pins, Margaret reads the morning's letters, already sorted downstairs by the butler and brought up with the wash water. There are 3 today, one from her sister in Bath, one from a woman on the parish charity committee, and one from the household's coal merchant regarding an overdue account. She reads them sitting very still, because any movement of her head threatens whatever Bridget is doing at that exact moment, and there is no time this morning to redo work. Mentally, she is already filing each letter. The one from her sister needs a warm reply today. The charity letter needs a considered answer about next week's fundraising bazaar. The coal merchant's account needs settling before the week's household reckoning on Friday. Now the dressing, and this is worth slowing down for, because the physical construction of a wealthy Victorian woman's daily appearance is, frankly, remarkable and deserves more attention than the single word, corset, usually gets in popular retellings. Margaret is not putting on one garment. She is being built into a structure, layers of linen, boning, wire and fabric engineered together to produce a very specific silhouette that 1881 considers correct for a respectable married woman. From the skin outward. First, the chemise, a loose shift of fine linen falling to mid-thigh, sitting between skin and the stiffer garments above it, protecting the expensive outer fabrics from the body's natural moisture. Second, the drawers still, in 1881, open at the crotch, a detail that looks strange to modern eyes but served an entirely practical purpose, given how many layers a woman had to manage in a hurry. Third, the corset, and here we should be careful, because the corset's reputation in popular history is not entirely fair. Margaret's everyday corset is made of a firm woven cotton called cowdle, reinforced with steel bones along the sides and a rigid steel busk down the center front that unhooks for quick removal. It laces up the back. Bridget laces it to Margaret's usual daily tightness, tight enough to shape the fashionable line, not tight enough to cause real distress. Margaret's waist inside the corset measures close to 21 inches, without it, closer to 24. A real reduction, but a modest one. She has worn a corset daily since she was roughly 13, and by now she notices it about as much as most people notice their shoes after the first hour of a day. What the corset provides, beyond shaping, is structural support the fashions of 1881 genuinely require. The dresses of this decade are cut, and seemed assuming the corseted silhouette underneath them. Remove the corset and the dress simply doesn't sit correctly. The whole visual argument of the outfit collapses. Fourth, a bustle by 1881, the fashion has moved past the wide crinoline skirts of 20 years earlier into a narrower profile with volume concentrated at the back. Margaret's bustle is a half-cage frame, tied at the waist, that pushes her skirts into the dramatic backward shelf the decade demands. Fifth, a single starched petticoat beneath the dress itself, giving the skirt body and a particular whispering movement Margaret has grown used to and stopped consciously hearing. And then the dress, the plum wool Bridget pressed this morning, a two-piece construction of bodice and skirt that hooks together at the waist. High collar edged in cream lace, sleeves fitted to the wrist and closed with small jet buttons, the whole bodice cut so precisely to Margaret's corseted shape that she cannot get in or out of it without help. The back closes with a long column of hooks running from waist to collar. Bridget fastens every one, a task that by itself takes close to 4 minutes. Stockings next, wool for a cool November morning held with ribbon garters above the knee. Boots with a small heel buttoned up the side with a hook. A small cameo brooch at the collar. A watch pinned at her waist. Gloves set aside, ready for when she leaves the house. Bridget steps back. Margaret turns in front of the mirror, checking both sides. Correct. The whole assembly, corset, bustle, petticoat, dress, boots, weighs something close to 13 pounds, and Margaret will wear it, or a heavier evening equivalent of it, for the next 14 hours. It is 8:15. She goes down to breakfast. Before we follow Margaret down to breakfast, let's pause for a moment on something the rest of tonight's story depends on. The household itself, the machine that Margaret's day is built to keep running. The Whitfield staff numbers 6, which is a step below Constance-level establishments you might have heard about in other Victorian accounts, but still a household that says, unmistakably, a rising professional family, comfortable and correct. There is a cook, who commands the kitchen with total authority and answers to almost no one except Margaret on matters of menu and expense. There is a parlor maid who answers the door, keeps the reception rooms immaculate, and serves at table when there are guests. There is a housemaid, responsible for the bedrooms, the grates, the endless carrying of hot water up and cold ash down. There is a kitchen maid who assists the cook and does the roughest of the kitchen work. There is Bridget, Margaret's own maid. And there is a single manservant who does double duty as something between a footman and a general handyman, since the household is not quite large enough to justify a full butler, though Charles has begun hinting that this may need to change soon, given who he's now representing in court. 6 servants sound, to modern ears, like extraordinary luxury, and by the standard of a factory worker's household it certainly was. But by the standard of Margaret's own social world, 6 servants is the minimum required to run a house of this size and maintain the standard of hospitality Charles's career now demands. Fewer than 6, and cracks would start to show. A room not quite ready for callers, a menu that repeats itself too often, a household that quietly signals it cannot quite keep pace with the family's rising position. Margaret understands this arithmetic instinctively, the way she understands the arithmetic of her own wardrobe. Appearance is not decoration in this world. Appearance is infrastructure. At breakfast, which she takes alone this morning since Charles left early for a client meeting, Margaret eats lightly toast, a boiled egg, tea, while going through the household's daily business in her head. At 8:30, exactly as she does every weekday without exception, the cook comes up from the kitchen for what the household, only half-jokingly, calls the conference. It is, in every meaningful sense, a management meeting, though neither woman would ever use that word. Over roughly 15 minutes, Margaret and the cook run through the day, confirm the menu for tonight's small family supper before they leave for the evening's real event, discuss a delivery of fish that arrived less fresh than it should have, decide whether to switch butchers over a persistent overcharging problem, and review what needs ordering for the week ahead given that Friday's household reckoning is approaching. The cook, a stout, capable woman named Mrs. Doyle who has been in service since she was 14, handles this exchange with the particular calm authority that experienced servants develop. She raises problems, offers her own recommendations, and defers the final decision to Margaret with a practiced deference that in no way disguises how much actual expertise she's bringing to the table. This is one of the things that tends to surprise people once they look closely at households like this one. The wealthy Victorian wife was not a passive figurehead drifting through rooms other people maintained. She was, in the fullest sense of the word, an administrator, running a small enterprise with a payroll, a supply chain, a budget, and a set of standards that had to be met daily without fail. The sphere she operated in was narrow by any modern measure. Within that narrow sphere, though, the competence required was real and considerable and entirely unrecognized outside the household's own 4 walls. By 9, Mrs. Doyle has gone back down to the kitchen, and the nursery maid brings Alice and Edmund down for their morning visit with their mother. This, like so much of Margaret's day, is a formal appointment rather than a spontaneous cuddle on the sofa, scheduled, expected, and governed by its own quiet conventions, though that doesn't make it any less genuinely warm. Alice, 5 years old and already reading in short, halting sentences, brings a picture book and reads 2 pages aloud with fierce concentration while Margaret listens and corrects her gently. Edmund, not yet 3, mostly wants to be held, and is, for the first 10 minutes, before losing interest and toddling off toward a low shelf of wooden blocks that live in the morning room specifically for these visits. This half hour tells you something important about how motherhood actually worked for a woman in Margaret's position. It was mediated, scheduled, formal in its rhythms, and it was also completely genuine. Margaret loves her children without reservation. She is also, undeniably, not their primary daily caretaker. That role belongs to the nursery maid, a young but capable woman named Sarah, who lives essentially inside the nursery and manages the children's daily rhythm, meals, naps, small illnesses, endless small negotiations over what may and may not be eaten, worn, or climbed on, with an authority that in practice exceeds Margaret's own moment-to-moment involvement. Margaret sets the overall direction. She approves the governess who will eventually take over Alice's early lessons. She decides on questions of discipline and character when they rise to her level. Sarah handles everything underneath that, all day, every day. To modern eyes, this division can look like distance, even coldness, and that reading misses what Margaret's social world actually believed good mothering meant. It did not mean constant physical presence. It meant ensuring that the environment, the staff, the moral instruction, the education eventually to come, was correct from the top down. It meant overseeing rather than doing, in the same way that overseeing a household's finances is different from personally counting out every coin, but is not, for that reason, any less real a form of responsibility. There is also a plainer, less ideological reason for the arrangement, sitting underneath the theory of proper motherhood. Margaret's day is already full of obligations that have nothing directly to do with her children and everything to do with Charles's career. The calls she must make and receive, the small dinners she hosts, the committee she sits on, the friendships she carefully tends because they matter to Charles professionally. None of this is leisure, however much it might resemble leisure from the outside. It is labor performed in service of the household's advancement, and if Margaret spent her mornings entirely in the nursery, the family's social position would begin, slowly and almost invisibly, to erode. The children are safe and well cared for. The social machinery, on the other hand, has no one but Margaret to run it. At 9:30, the children go back upstairs, and Margaret sits down at her own small writing desk, not as fine as some, a plain mahogany piece by the window, but hers, arranged exactly as she likes it, correspondence box, a jar of ink, a blotter, a stack of cream notepaper ordered from a stationer 2 streets from Charles's chambers. She will spend close to an hour here, and this hour, quiet and solitary as it looks, is one of the most functionally important of her entire day. We should linger on this, because Victorian letter writing gets flattened in most popular retellings into a vague picture of ladies exchanging pleasantries, when in fact it was the actual infrastructure that held social life together. There is no telephone. There is no casual dropping, in the way an earlier or later era might allow. A letter received yesterday requires a reply today or tomorrow at the very latest. A luncheon attended requires a thank you note within 2 days. An invitation requires an answer, acceptance or polite decline, promptly and in writing. None of these are gentle suggestions. Failing to observe them is a genuine social lapse, quietly noted, quietly remembered, and capable of doing real damage to a family standing over time. This morning Margaret writes 4 letters. One to her sister, warm and full of small domestic news, Edmund's new words, Alice's reading, a funny thing the cook said about the fishmonger. One to the charity committee, confirming she will help organize refreshments for next week's fundraising bazaar and offering 2 names of women who might be persuaded to donate baked goods. One declining, with careful and entirely sincere-sounding regret, an invitation to an evening musical party thrown by a woman named Mrs. Pemberton Hayes, whose evenings have a well-earned reputation for running past midnight. A reputation Margaret cannot afford to indulge this particular week. And one brief, businesslike note to the coal merchant, enclosing payment and a polite but pointed note about the punctuality of future deliveries. 4 letters in under an hour, each one pitched in exactly the right tone for its recipient and purpose, written in the clear, practiced hand Margaret was drilled in as a girl, and which now flows out of her without conscious effort. She seals them, addresses them, and leaves them on the hall table for the manservant to carry to the post office with the mid-morning collection. It is not yet 11. Margaret has been awake for 4.5 hours. She has managed a household staff of 6, spent formal time with both her children, and conducted, in writing, 4 separate pieces of social business, each one small on its own and collectively enormous in what they add up to over a year, over a decade, over a career. And she is dressed, at this point, in roughly 13 pounds of carefully engineered clothing. The visible part of her day, the part a portrait would actually try to capture, has not yet even begun. Let's pause here and talk for a moment about what all of this actually cost, because the numbers tell their own story, and it's a story most popular accounts of Victorian ladies skip over entirely. We have reasonably good historical records for households at this exact income level, account books, advice manuals, wage surveys from the period, and they let us reconstruct the picture with real precision. Staff wages were the single largest expense in a household like the Whitfields. A cook of Mrs. Doyle's experience earned somewhere between £30 and £45 a year. A parlour maid perhaps £16 to £22. A housemaid and kitchen maid similarly, in the mid-teens to low 20s. A lady's maid like Bridget, valued for her particular skills, generally sat a little above the general household staff, perhaps £20 to £28. The manservant, doing something close to a footman's duties, perhaps £25 to £35. All told, staff wages for a household this size ran to somewhere around £140 to £180 a year, and that's before accounting for their uniforms, their food, and their lodging, all of which the household was expected to provide on top of wages. Food for a household of 8 people, family and staff combined, plus the additional cost of any entertaining, ran to a further £100 to £140 annually. Margaret's own clothing, dresses, boots, gloves, hats, the whole seasonal wardrobe a woman of her position was expected to maintain, cost somewhere in the range of £100 to £150 a year, a sum that would represent several years' wages for the housemaid ironing the petticoats that made up part of it. Charles earned, at this point in his career, somewhere close to £1,200 a year. Respectable, comfortable, but a good distance below the truly wealthy tiers of Victorian society, and every pound of it had to be allocated with real care. There's a wonderful, slightly startling document from this period called an advice manual. Similar books were extremely popular throughout the era. That lays out, with total matter-of-fact confidence, exactly how much a household at various income levels ought to spend on female clothing, entertaining, charitable subscriptions, cab and carriage hire, personal stationery, and a dozen other categories most modern readers wouldn't think to itemize at all. These weren't presented as optional luxuries. They were presented as necessary costs of maintaining a respectable position, as fixed as rent, as unavoidable as food. Margaret controls the household's day-to-day accounts herself, a completely standard arrangement for women of her class and era. Charles provides a monthly household allowance. Margaret manages it, keeps the books, and negotiates adjustments when something unexpected arises. A servant who leaves and must be replaced, an unplanned medical expense, an invitation to something important enough that the wardrobe budget needs stretching. He trusts her judgment on all of it almost completely, which is simultaneously a genuine mark of partnership and a fairly clear sign that he has no particular wish to deal with any of it himself. The numbers, the suppliers, the staff relationships, the constant small decisions about where money goes and why, all of it lives inside Margaret's domain, unpaid, untitled, and entirely real. At 11 o'clock, she puts on her gloves and picks up her card case. It's time for calls. A morning call in 1881 is nothing like the words suggest to a modern ear. It doesn't happen in the morning. For one thing, it happens in the window between roughly 11 and 2 in the afternoon, which the Victorians, working from an older sense of the day organized around meals rather than clock hours, still call morning. It lasts, by unwritten but universally understood convention, somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes. It is conducted with a level of formality that would strike most of us today as almost comically rigid, and which, to the people actually doing it, is simply how life is lived. The purpose of the morning call is not really conversation, though conversation happens. The purpose is the gesture itself, showing up correctly dressed, at correctly the right hour, for exactly the right length of time, and departing with precisely calibrated warmth. Miss too many calls on an acquaintance, and the relationship quietly withers without a single unkind word ever being spoken. Overstay or drift into subjects too personal for the occasion, and you've committed a small social violation that will be discussed, gently but definitely, at other women's morning calls the following week. The whole system runs on everyone knowing the rules well enough that no one ever needs to state them out loud. Today Margaret is receiving rather than making a call. A woman named Mrs. Alderton is expected at 11:30, the wife of a barrister who has recently begun sending Charles referral work, which makes the relationship, on Margaret's side of the ledger, considerably more important than a casual friendship might suggest. Mrs. Alderton is perhaps 10 years older than Margaret, more established, moving in slightly higher circles, and the connection is one Margaret cultivates with real deliberateness, because she is, in this particular friendship, the junior party. Mrs. Alderton is doing Margaret something close to a favor simply by calling at all. The drawing room has been prepared since breakfast. Fresh flowers arrived from the florist this morning, white chrysanthemums, since it's November and roses are neither in season nor easily affordable. The fire is lit, because even indoors a London November has a chill that 13 pounds of wool and bonning doesn't entirely keep out. The good china sits ready but not yet laid out. Tea will only appear if the conversation runs long enough to warrant it, and whether it does is itself a small, unstated social signal about how the visit is going. The room smells faintly of beeswax polish, chrysanthemums, and the lavender water the housemaid uses on the furniture every week without fail. Mrs. Alderton arrives at 11:28. 2 minutes early is itself a small, deliberate courtesy, and is shown up by the parlor maid. Margaret rises to receive her, and the quiet choreography of the formal call begins. The conversation moves through its familiar, well-worn channels. The children's health is mentioned, briefly, warmly. A recent dinner both women attended is discussed with careful approval. Someone in their shared circle has been unwell, which is raised with appropriate concern, and just enough detail to prove genuine interest without crossing into gossip. A charitable event coming up next month is touched on. Current affairs come up obliquely. A recent parliamentary debate everyone seems to be discussing, mentioned in passing rather than argued over, since direct political opinion is not quite the thing for a morning call, though being visibly aware of the news absolutely is expected. The weather gets its own few minutes, not because either woman finds the weather remotely interesting, but because it's a completely safe conversational lubricant, a way to begin and to punctuate without any risk of controversy. Mrs. Alderton admires the chrysanthemums. Margaret mentions, with the exact right degree of studied casualness, which florist she uses, information offered as a small gift rather than a boast, though everyone in the room understands it's doing a bit of both at once. 20 minutes after arriving, Mrs. Alderton rises. Margaret rises with her. They exchange the formal goodbye, a warm word about seeing each other again soon, a level of warmth carefully measured to match the actual closeness of the relationship rather than exceeding it. The parlor maid shows her out. Margaret hears the front door close and crosses the hall toward her next task. It's nearly noon now, and there is no time for lingering, because at 3 o'clock this afternoon Margaret has a fitting at her dressmaker's for a gown she'll need in a fortnight. And before that there is the matter of the family's small supper tonight to confirm with Mrs. Doyle, correspondence from the charity committee to review, and something she genuinely looks forward to, though she would never describe it in those terms to anyone outside her own head, perhaps half an hour with a book, if the day cooperates. At 12:30, Margaret eats a light luncheon alone in the morning room, cold meat, bread, a little fruit, reviewing the charity committee's correspondence as she eats. She sits on the committee of a society that assists impoverished gentlewomen, women of her own class who, through widowhood or a husband's financial ruin or simple bad luck, have fallen into genuine hardship with no practical means of supporting themselves in a world that never trained them for any paid occupation. This is not an abstract cause to Margaret. She knows personally 2 women who are a single bad year away from needing exactly this kind of help themselves. The society provides small pensions, help finding respectable lodging, and in some cases assistance securing one of the very few employment options open to an educated woman without independent means, governessing chiefly, sometimes a position as a paid companion. The meetings are real. The decisions carry real weight. The need behind them is entirely real. At 2:30, the carriage is brought round, a modest brougham, the family's one real indulgence beyond the house itself, costing something in the neighborhood of £120 to £160 a year once the horses feed, the coachman's wages, and the vehicle's upkeep are all added together. Giving it up would save real money. It would also announce, to absolutely everyone who noticed its absence, that the Whitfield household was retreating rather than advancing. And in a world where appearance functions as a form of currency, that is not a message Margaret or Charles can afford to send. The brougham carries her to Madame Celine's, a dressmaking establishment on a fashionable street that operates as something between a shop and a private consultancy. Madame Celine does not make cheap clothing. She makes clothing that is correct to the current fashion, correct to the client's social position, and correct in the precise technical sense that every seam has been fitted to the client's own corseted figure, with an attention most modern tailoring reserves only for the most expensive bespoke work. Today's fitting is for a formal dinner dress needed for an event 3 weeks from now, a dinner at the home of one of Charles's most important new clients, an occasion where what Margaret wears will be noticed by everyone present, and the note taken will reflect, whether fairly or not, on Charles. The dress taking shape is a deep bottle green silk with dark trim, cut with a slight train appropriate to the formality of the occasion. Madame Celine has already constructed a toile, a rough mock-up in cheap muslin used to perfect the fit before the expensive final fabric is ever touched by scissors, and Margaret stands in it now, while a fitter works pins and tailors chalk around her with quick, practiced hands, making the tiny adjustments that separate a dress that merely fits from one that genuinely transforms the wearer. The fitting takes about 35 minutes. Throughout it, Margaret and Madame Celine discuss the dress with a particular kind of mutual professional respect. Madame Celine is not, formally, Margaret's social equal. She is, in the language of the period, in trade. But inside this room, on questions of cut and fabric and fashion, she is unquestionably the authority, and Margaret defers to her judgment in a way she would defer to almost no one else in her own social circle. While she stands in the half-finished dress, Margaret's mind drifts, as it often does during fittings, to the evening ahead, not tonight's quiet family supper, but a larger dinner 2 weeks off that she's already beginning to plan for in her head, running through the guest list, considering who will likely sit near whom, what she knows about each person that might be useful or dangerous in conversation. This kind of ongoing, half-conscious social preparation runs continuously in the background of Margaret's mind, the way a person managing any complex, high-stakes project finds themselves quietly working the problem even while doing something else entirely. She's home from the fitting by 3:30, with just under 2 hours before she needs to begin dressing for tonight's smaller family supper. And here, finally, is the gap in the day, not free time exactly, since nothing in Margaret's schedule is ever truly unclaimed, but the closest thing to it she'll get. She settles into the chair by the morning room window, where the early afternoon light still reaches in November, and picks up the novel she's currently reading, Middlemarch, by George Eliot, a book she read once as a younger woman and has recently begun again, finding, to her quiet surprise, that it says something different to her now at 29 than it did at 22. She reads for perhaps 35 minutes, uninterrupted, managing nothing, responsible for no one's comfort but her own. The house moves quietly around her, Mrs. Doyle in the kitchen, the children upstairs with Sarah, the fire settling in the grate. This half hour is not laziness, and it is not indulgence, whatever the language of the era might imply about idle women and novels. It is, in the fullest sense, the only real privacy Margaret has had since she opened her eyes at 6:30 this morning. In another 25 minutes, it will be over, and the second half of her day, the visible half, the half a portrait would try to capture, will begin. At 4:30, Margaret calls for the housemaid to begin filling the bath. Tonight's supper is not, in fact, the small family affair we mentioned earlier. Plans changed over the course of the afternoon, as they occasionally do in a household like this one. A note arrived by messenger just after luncheon. Charles's most promising new client, a shipping merchant named Mr. Ashworth Reed, will be in London only tonight rather than next week as originally planned, and Charles has invited him, along with his wife, to dine with them this evening instead of at the larger dinner Margaret had been mentally preparing for. 6 weeks of careful anticipation compressed, without warning, into 6 hours of preparation. This is, in its own way, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday for a household like the Whitfields. Margaret receives this news with outward calm and a great deal of quiet, rapid internal recalculation. The menu Mrs. Doyle had planned for a quiet family evening will not do for a guest whose good opinion may shape Charles's entire career trajectory over the next several years. Margaret is downstairs within minutes, standing in the kitchen doorway, a location she rarely occupies, since direction is normally given through Mrs. Doyle's morning visits upstairs rather than in person, working through what can realistically be assembled and elevated in the hours remaining. A soup that can be started immediately. The fish that arrived this morning, meant for tomorrow, now pressed into tonight's service instead. A joint of beef that will need to go into the oven within the hour if it's to be ready in time. Mrs. Doyle, entirely unruffled by any of this, she has managed far worse surprises in her career, begins issuing quiet instructions to the kitchen maid before Margaret has even finished speaking. This small crisis, resolved calmly and almost invisibly within 20 minutes, is worth pausing on, because it's exactly the kind of moment that never appears in a Victorian portrait and rarely survives in the popular imagination of the era at all. The elegant dinner Mr. and Mrs. Reed will sit down to at 7:30 tonight will look, to them, like the natural, unhurried product of a well-run household. It will, in fact, be the product of Margaret's ability to absorb a genuine emergency, recalculate an entire evening's logistics in the space of a single conversation, and issue clear, correct instructions without a flicker of visible strain. A skill that, again, appears nowhere in any account of her accomplishments, and that no institution anywhere would ever think to credit her for. By 4:30, the crisis handled, Margaret goes upstairs for her bath. The evening bath runs differently from the quick morning wash. Hot water has been carried up in heavy copper jugs, 3 trips worth from the housemaid, to fill the tub to a workable depth. The water is warm rather than scalding, scented with a few drops of rose oil Bridget adds without needing to be asked. Margaret stays in for close to 20 minutes, washing her hair as well tonight, which complicates the evening's timeline slightly. Wet hair takes longer to dress properly, but is, she has decided, worth the extra time, since clean hair simply behaves better under the elaborate evening style Bridget will need to build. While she bathes, no one makes any demand on her. Bridget is in the adjoining dressing room laying out tonight's clothes, but nothing requires Margaret's attention or judgment for these 20 minutes. This, along with the half hour spent this afternoon with Middlemark, is one of the only 2 pockets of real privacy in Margaret's entire day. She uses it, as she often does, simply to feel what the day has actually been like rather than manage it, and today, despite the last-minute scramble over dinner, has been on the whole a good one. Mrs. Alderton's call went well. The dress at Madame Ceylan's is coming along beautifully. The kitchen crisis was handled cleanly, without a single raised voice. She does not feel, precisely, happy. Happiness feels like too simple and too static a word for the layered texture of a day like this one. But stepping out of the bath and wrapping herself in the warm towel Bridget has left by the small coal fire, she feels something close to capable. She feels, in other words, like herself. Evening dressing takes close to 50 minutes tonight, considerably longer than the morning routine, and differs from it in several important ways. The corset is the same garment, though Bridget laces it a fraction more snugly than this morning. The line of an evening bodice demands it, and Margaret knows she can tolerate the added tightness for a single evening seated dinner without real discomfort. The dress itself is far more elaborate than anything worn during the day. Low at the neckline, short-sleeved, in a deep wine-red velvet bodice over a pale ivory silk skirt, with jet beading across the bodice that catches every flicker of candlelight when she moves. Around her neck, a strand of pearls that belong to her own mother, not the most fashionable piece she owns, but real and old, and quietly significant in the way genuinely good jewelry tends to be. In her hair, now rebuilt by Bridget into a more formal, more elevated version of this morning's chignon, small pearl combs catch the light to match the necklace. Bridget works with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who has done this exact sequence hundreds of times. Hair pinned, dress fastened up its long column of hooks, jewelry clasped, long gloves in white kid rolled carefully up past the elbow and fastened at the wrist, a small folded fan tucked into the glove, evening slippers in ivory satin slipped on last of all. Margaret stands in front of the full-length mirror and studies herself with the particular expression of someone conducting a professional inspection rather than admiring her own reflection. Is the hair correctly built? Does the pearl necklace sit right against the neckline? Is the whole composition pitched at exactly the right level of formality for tonight's altered, higher-stakes occasion, rather than either underdressed or, worse, visibly overdressed in a way that might look like she's trying too hard to impress a client her husband badly needs to keep happy? The verdict, after a long, careful look, correct. It will do exactly what it needs to do. It's 6:20. Charles arrives home at 7:30, dresses himself in the 15 minutes a man's evening wardrobe generally requires, and by 7:05 the two of them are standing together in the drawing room, running through the evening's plan one final time before the Reeds arrive. Margaret already knows, from a brief conversation with Charles in the hallway, roughly what she needs to know about Mr. Reed. A self-made man, shipping interests, recently widowed and remarried to a considerably younger second wife who is, by Charles's slightly awkward account, modern in her opinions. Margaret files this away. It will matter in about an hour. The Reeds arrive at 7:30. Margaret receives them in the drawing room with the same practiced warmth she offered Mrs. Alderton this morning, adjusted upward in formality to suit the occasion and the stakes. Mrs. Reed, Eleanor, as she asks to be called almost immediately, a small informality that Margaret notes with interest, is perhaps 5 years younger than Margaret, sharply dressed in a style slightly ahead of what's currently fashionable in Margaret's own circle, and within the first few minutes of conversation, reveals herself to hold genuinely strong opinions on the question of women's education. A subject that has been simmering in the periodical press for months following a widely discussed essay Margaret herself read only last week. This is, in its own small way, exactly the kind of moment the whole apparatus of Margaret's day has been preparing her for. She cannot dismiss Eleanor Reed's opinions, since doing so would risk seeming closed-minded in front of a woman whose husband's goodwill Charles urgently needs. She cannot enthusiastically agree either, at least not without knowing more about where Eleanor's opinions sit relative to her husband's own. A shipping merchant's views on his wife's education are not always identical to his wife's views on the subject. So Margaret does what years of exactly this kind of conversational tightrope have trained her to do. She asks a genuinely interested, carefully open-ended question, draws Alina out a little further, and steers the conversation toward the recently opened women's college at Cambridge, a subject she can discuss with real, informed interest without committing herself to any position stronger than curiosity. It works. By the time they move through to dinner at 8:30, Alina Reed has decided visibly that she likes Margaret. Dinner itself, soup, the rescued fish course, the beef joint Mrs. Doyle managed to have ready despite 4 hours less notice than she'd have liked, a modest sweet course to finish, runs close to 2 hours, with Charles and Mr. Reed talking shipping contracts and London property at one end of the small table, while Margaret and Alina continue their own thread of conversation at the other, occasionally crossing over into the shared discussion when something of general interest comes up. Margaret manages, over these 2 hours, something that looks from the outside like simply enjoying a pleasant dinner, and is, underneath, a genuinely demanding piece of social choreography. Keeping Alina engaged and comfortable, making sure Mr. Reed feels sufficiently attended to without monopolizing him, and cutting into the business conversation he and Charles clearly need to have, timing her own contributions to the table's general conversation so that she appears neither withdrawn nor overbearing, and quietly, without either guest noticing, smoothing over one slightly awkward moment when Mr. Reed makes an offhand comment about women who read too much, that could, handled badly, have curdled the whole evening. Margaret laughs it off with just the right light touch, redirects to a story about Alice's reading habits that reframes the whole subject as a fond domestic anecdote rather than a live political argument, and the moment passes without anyone at the table quite realizing how close it came to becoming a genuine problem. This is invisible labor in its purest form, the constant, unacknowledged maintenance work of an evening like this one. It requires reading the room continuously, understanding who is uncomfortable and why, and knowing exactly which small adjustment will ease the temperature back down without drawing any attention to the fact that an adjustment was needed at all. The skill is only successful if it's completely unseen. A well-managed dinner, like a well-run household, is meant to look effortless. The effort itself must vanish entirely, leaving only the result behind. The Reeds leave a little after 10:30, warmly. Both of them, Alina takes Margaret's hand at the door for a moment longer than strict formality requires, and says, with what sounds like real sincerity, that she hopes they'll see one another again soon. Charles, closing the door behind them, exhales in a way Margaret recognizes immediately as pure relief. "That went well," he says. "Better than well, I think." Margaret agrees, and means it, and feels, beneath the simple satisfaction of a difficult evening successfully managed, something closer to genuine pride in a piece of work well done, even though no one beyond this hallway will ever describe it in those terms. The house settles into quiet a little after 11. Margaret and Charles talk for a few minutes in the hallway, then a few minutes more in the drawing room over the last of the fire, going back over the evening the way people do when something important has just gone right, and they want to hold onto the feeling a little longer before letting the day end. Charles thinks Reed's business could mean real, sustained work for the practice over the next several years, not one contract but a whole relationship, the kind that builds a career rather than simply padding a single quarter's accounts. Margaret listens, asks the right questions, offers her own read of Alina Reed, which Charles takes seriously, as he generally does. These few minutes, unhurried and unscheduled, are among the most honest of the entire day. Two people who know each other well, briefly alone, without an audience, without a performance left to give. At 11:30 they go up. Bridget is waiting, has been waiting since before 10, and the evening's undressing begins the same architecture as this morning's dressing, run entirely in reverse, with the same unhurried care given to each piece. The pearl necklace goes back into its case. The wine velvet bodice is checked for any mark or stain from the evening and hung on its form. The corset is unlaced, and Margaret feels the particular, familiar relief of a full evening's breath returning to her all at once. The elaborate evening hairstyle comes down, pin by pin, and Bridget works the brush through it in long, slow strokes. Not the quick maintenance brushing of the morning, but something closer to ritual. 100 unhurried strokes that redistribute the day's oils and pull the last trace of pomade out of the hair. The routine both women have performed together several thousand times by now without ever once discussing why it matters. Margaret sits at the dressing table and looks at her own reflection in the low candlelight, and what looks back is, quite noticeably, a different woman than the one who walked into the drawing room to receive the reeds 4 hours ago. Not worse, not better, simply quieter. The constructed version of herself. The one who navigates dinner tables and difficult husbands and delicate conversational moments about women's education with total composure, is coming apart layer by layer along with the dress. And what's left underneath, by the time Bridget ties off the night braid and says good night, is simply a tired woman at the very end of a very long day. She reads for perhaps 15 minutes by the last of the fire, Middlemark again, the same passage she was in this afternoon, about a young woman named Dorothea standing at a window looking out at a road, feeling, in a way the book never quite names outright, simultaneously full and empty. Margaret reads it slowly, twice, the way she has started doing lately with passages that seem to be saying something to her that she hasn't fully worked out how to receive. Then she closes the book, puts out the candle, and gets into bed. It is close to midnight. She has been awake for 18 hours. She managed a staff of 6, wrote 4 letters, received 1 caller, sat for a dress fitting, absorbed and solved a genuine dinner party emergency with 2 hours' notice, hosted and steered an evening that may reshape her husband's entire career, and wore, across the day, something close to 26 pounds of engineered clothing between the morning and evening outfits combined. Tomorrow, the notebook on the writing desk downstairs already has 3 items on it. She is asleep within minutes. Let's step back now from Margaret's single day, because a single day, however detailed, can only tell you so much. To really understand what wealthy Victorian women's lives were built from, we need to widen the lens considerably. Into the money that underpinned this whole world, the education that shaped women like Margaret before they ever became women like Margaret, the charity work that filled a huge portion of their calendars, the rhythms of the social season, the state of their health, and the long, slow current of change running underneath the whole 64 years of Victoria's reign. Start with money, because money is the skeleton holding up everything else we've watched tonight. Historians working from surviving household account books, wage surveys, and the advice manual literature of the period have been able to reconstruct, with real precision, what different tiers of Victorian income actually bought. A household at the Whitfields level, call it somewhere between £1,000 and £1,300 a year in the early 1880s, sat solidly in the professional upper middle class, comfortable, respectable, and constantly working to maintain a position that was real but not, by any means, unshakable. For context, a skilled factory worker of this period earned perhaps £50 to £70 a year. A schoolteacher might earn 60 to 100. A curate, perhaps 100. A moderately successful shopkeeper running his own business might clear 200 to 300. A solicitor early in a solid but unspectacular career, 400 to 600. Above the Whitfields, a genuinely prosperous barrister or a successful merchant might earn £2,000 to £3,000 annually, and the truly wealthy, the larger landed gentry, the most successful men in finance and industry, could earn £5,000 and considerably more. At the Whitfields level, roughly the picture breaks down like this across a typical year. Rent on the Belgravia house, somewhere around £160 to £200. Staff wages, as we discussed, close to £150 to £180. Food and household provisions, including the additional cost of entertaining, another £100 to £140. The carriage and horse, £120 to £160. Margaret's own clothing, £100 to £150. the children's nursery expenses, and, eventually, education, another 50 to 70. Charitable subscriptions and the constant small social expenses, cards, gloves, modest gifts, tips to other household servants when visiting, another 30 to 40. Charles's own personal and professional expenses, perhaps 120 to 150. All told, somewhere close to 900 to 1,000 pounds spent against an income of roughly 1,100 to 1,300, leaving a margin that is real, but not enormous, and that leaves very little room for a genuinely bad year. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something important about the particular flavor of anxiety that runs underneath a household like Margaret's. It isn't the anxiety of poverty. No one in this house is worried about food or shelter in any immediate sense. It's a narrower, more specific anxiety about the maintenance of position, the carriage, the staff. The dinner parties, these aren't simply comforts. They are social infrastructure, and losing any one of them wouldn't make the Whitfields poor in any absolute sense, but it would communicate something to their social world that could be very difficult to undo. What a household looks like determines what opportunities become available to it, which in turn determines what the household can afford to look like in the future. A closed loop, and the stakes inside it are entirely real, even if the amounts of money involved would strike a factory worker's family as almost unimaginable wealth. Now let's talk about education, because this connects directly to the conversation Margaret had tonight with Alina Reed, and it's one of the more genuinely interesting and under-discussed corners of this whole subject. A girl of Margaret's class and generation was typically educated at home by a governess until around 16, at which point she formally entered society. The marriage market, essentially, dressed up in the language of balls and introductions, and eventually married. The governess's curriculum, though it varied enormously from household to household, generally covered French as a genuinely expected conversational skill, sometimes German or Italian as well, piano and singing, both expected to reach a level of real competence suitable for drawing room performance. Drawing and watercolor painting, treated as a social accomplishment but often requiring genuine technical skill. Literature and history. A general subject sometimes called natural philosophy, covering the basics of science as it was then understood. Arithmetic, though rarely taken very far. Scripture. And with enormous and careful attention, the practical social knowledge, etiquette, deportment, correspondence, the theory and practice of household management. That fills nearly every hour of the day we just spent with Margaret. This education, at its best, produced women who were genuinely well-read, seriously engaged with the ideas of their time, and entirely capable of holding their own in exactly the kind of conversation Margaret had tonight with Alina Reed about women's education itself. And it simultaneously trained those same women for a life in which almost none of that intellectual capacity could be applied through any recognized profession. The education was real. The ceiling above it was equally real. Both facts sat side by side, without much acknowledgement that there was any tension between them at all. Margaret's own generation sits right at the point where this tension is beginning, slowly, to become visible as a tension rather than simply the natural order of things. Girton College at Cambridge, the first residential college for women in England, had opened in 1869. Newnham followed in 1875. By 1881, women are studying there, sitting the same examinations Cambridge men sit, being marked against the same standard, and receiving no formal degree for it, a state of affairs that will not change until 1948. Margaret knows about Girton. She knows women, distantly, who have sent daughters there, and other women who have argued fiercely about whether they should. Alice is only 5. The question of what Margaret and Charles might eventually decide for her isn't urgent yet. But it's there, in the air of Margaret's social world, in a way it simply would not have been a decade or two earlier, and it's exactly the subtext running underneath tonight's dinner table conversation with Alina Reed. even though neither woman named it quite so directly. Then there's the charity work, which filled a genuinely substantial part of the upper-middle-class Victorian woman's calendar, and gets flattened, in most popular accounts, into a vague image of well-dressed women being decorative at meetings and signing documents with their husbands' names underneath their own. The reality is considerably more substantial than that image allows. By the 1880s, Victorian Britain has an enormous, dense ecosystem of charitable and philanthropic organizations, and women are not peripheral to that ecosystem. In many of these organizations, they are the primary operational force. They visit the poor directly in their own homes, which required both real courage and genuine practical knowledge of the conditions they were walking into. They ran mothers' meetings in soup kitchens and small parish schools. They organized the fundraising events, bazaars, subscription concerts, charity sales that generated the actual cash keeping these organizations running from one year to the next. They made the case for their causes in exactly the drawing rooms and dining rooms where their social circuits already ran, turning social capital directly into practical fundraising. They wrote the letters, managed the committee meetings, and coordinated the volunteers. This was, in every meaningful sense, real organizational management, invisible again, exactly like the household management we've spent all evening examining, but real, with real decisions, real budgets, and real consequences for the people the charities served. Margaret's own committee work for the Society Assisting Impoverished Gentlewomen is not, to her, an abstract exercise in Victorian virtue signaling. It is work she takes seriously, connected to women she genuinely knows and genuinely worries about. This charitable engagement mattered for wealthy Victorian women in more than one way. It gave them a form of purposeful work their strictly domestic role didn't fully satisfy, and it was one of the very few arenas in which they could exercise real, publicly recognized organizational authority. Historians have pointed out, and it's worth repeating here, that the Victorian charitable world functioned as a kind of accidental training ground, the space where many of the women who would go on to become the first female local government officials, the first professional social reformers, the first women active in formal public life, got their earliest practical experience running something. It was an unintentional pipeline, entirely unacknowledged as such at the time, but real all the same. Let's talk now about the season, because nothing shaped the actual calendar year rhythm of a woman like Margaret's life more completely than this single institution. The London season, as it was known throughout the Victorian era, ran roughly from late April through the end of July, the period when Parliament sat, drawing political and professional families into the city, and when the great concentrated machinery of upper-class social life clicked into its highest gear. This was the stretch of the year that produced the balls, the formal evening parties, the presentations at court for young women just entering society, the major race meetings, with Ascot in June standing at the very top of the calendar as the single most important social fixture of the year. A well-positioned family during the season might have dinner engagements 5 or 6 nights out of 7. They might attend 2 or 3 balls in a single week. Afternoon garden parties filled whatever daylight hours weren't already claimed. Morning calls came in such volume that they required their own dedicated logistical planning, a task that fell, inevitably, to Margaret. For a woman in Margaret's position, the season is less an event than a full-time organizational project layered on top of everything else we've already watched her manage. She is making and receiving morning calls at a rate that would be considered unusual, even excessive, during the quieter winter months. She is attending or helping host large evening parties requiring temporary additional staff hired specifically for the occasion. She is having new dresses made at a pace that puts real pressure even on someone as capable as Madame Céline. She is coordinating a social schedule so dense that the small leather notebook she keeps becomes, by June, almost inadequate to the task. She genuinely loves large parts of it. The season is, among other things, one of the more purely enjoyable stretches of the year, full of music and movement and interesting company, and it exhausts her in something close to equal measure. After the season disperses in late July, the fashionable world scatters for the late summer and early autumn. Country house visits fill August and September, and for families with the right connections, a stretch of weeks in Scotland during the grouse shooting season is one of the genuine pleasures of the year. Margaret and Charles, through a connection of Charles's father, are sometimes invited to a house in the Scottish borders for 2 or 3 weeks in late August, and this stretch of the year has a completely different texture from everything else we've described tonight. The formality loosens. The evenings run more relaxed. Margaret reads more, walks more, sleeps a genuinely full night more nights than not. The children, away from the stricter boundaries of London life, spend entire days outdoors rather than the carefully scheduled nursery hour we watched this morning. Alice chasing something through long grass, Edmund toddling after her, both of them coming in at dusk with mud on their shoes in a way that would be unthinkable in Belgravia. Margaret watches this and thinks, more than once, that this is probably the version of childhood her own children will actually remember, rather than the formal 10-minute visits to the morning room that fill most of their London year. October and November bring the family back to town, and the gradual resumption of the full social calendar, less intense than the season itself, but substantial. A dinner most weeks, the occasional musical evening, which Margaret privately enjoys rather more than she generally admits, since the standard of domestic music-making in good London drawing rooms in this period is often genuinely excellent. Charity committee work tends to intensify through the winter months, since the needed addresses intensifies along with the cold. And running underneath all of it, every season, every month, the constant work we've spent this whole night examining. The household accounts, the correspondence, the morning calls, the invisible daily labor that never pauses regardless of what the wider social calendar happens to be doing. Now let's turn to health, because the Victorian era's relationship with women's health is genuinely complicated, and popular history tends to get it wrong in both directions at once, sometimes exaggerating the horrors, sometimes glossing over real and serious problems. Medicine in this period was improving in real, measurable ways. Surgical technique was advancing. Pharmacology was slowly becoming more scientific. Germ theory, established through the work of scientists across the 1860s and 1870s, was beginning to genuinely transform how doctors thought about disease and prevention. At the same time, medical thinking specifically about women's bodies remained tangled up with social ideology in ways that produced some genuinely harmful nonsense, dressed up in the authoritative language of science. The most damaging of these ideas held that the body carried only a limited, fixed supply of vital energy, and that any of it diverted toward intellectual effort, serious study, advanced education, would necessarily be drawn away from the reproductive system, with dangerous consequences for a woman's health and fertility. This was not a fringe theory whispered at the margins. It was published in respected medical journals, cited seriously in arguments against admitting women to universities, and treated by a great many otherwise educated people as simply established fact. It had, needless to say, no genuine scientific basis whatsoever. The physical toll of fashionable dress, on the other hand, was considerably more real, even if popular history has sometimes exaggerated its severity. A corset worn too tightly over many years could compress the lower ribs and put real pressure on the liver and digestive organs. The weight of heavy skirts and multiple layers placed genuine strain on the hips and lower back over the course of a long day. And the broadly sedentary nature of much upper-class social life, hours in drawing rooms, hours in carriages, hours at a writing desk, combined with a fashionable ideal that prized a delicate, inactive femininity, meant that many wealthy Victorian women were, in practical terms, considerably less physically fit than they might otherwise have been. Margaret manages this better than many of her peers. She walks whenever London's streets and weather allow, she rides when the family is in the country, and she has quietly adopted the habit of using the household's back staircase rather than always ringing for assistance. A small, mildly irregular choice by the standards of her class, but one she considers worth the minor eccentricity for the exercise it provides. There was, by this point in the century, a genuine dress reform movement, arguing with real medical evidence behind it that fashionable clothing was doing measurable damage to women's bodies, and a small but growing number of women who took physical exercise seriously as its own pursuit rather than an incidental byproduct of daily life. These women were, for the most part, rather more mocked than taken seriously by the wider social world Margaret moves in. That would begin to change more dramatically in the 1890s, when the bicycle produced a genuine and rapid transformation in women's physical freedom, allowing women out of doors, moving their bodies vigorously, without the full formal architecture of Victorian feminine dress and deportment weighing them down. Margaret, in 1881, is a decade ahead of that particular revolution. Childbirth deserves its own honest mention here, because it shaped wealthy Victorian women's lives in ways that morning calls and dinner parties don't capture at all. Margaret has 2 living children and may well have more. Family sizes among households at her income level were, on average, somewhat smaller than the popular image of enormous Victorian broods suggests, and shrinking further as the century progressed, partly as knowledge of contraception, however imperfect, spread gradually through educated circles, and partly because the real financial and social cost of properly raising and launching multiple children at this social level was well understood by everyone involved. 2 to 5 children was typical, and every single pregnancy carried real weight and real risk. Maternal mortality in this period was not negligible. Childbirth itself was genuinely dangerous, and infant mortality, even among wealthy families with access to the best available medical care, remained a real and present possibility rather than a distant statistic. Every woman in Margaret's social circle had, by her late 20s, lost someone, a sister, a cousin, a close friend to childbirth or its immediate aftermath. Pregnancy itself carried its own social invisibility. A visibly pregnant woman did not appear in society past a certain point. She withdrew, which in practice meant a dramatic reduction in her social calendar during the later months, a withdrawal that some women found a welcome rest and others found genuinely isolating, depending entirely on the individual woman and the individual pregnancy. The care of young children through minor illness fell mostly to mothers and nursery staff together, with the family doctor called in only when something looked genuinely serious. Margaret manages small illnesses with a combination of her own accumulated experience, a well-worn household medical guide kept on the shelf alongside Mrs. Doyle's cookery books, and occasional consultation with the family physician. Between Alice and Edmund, she lost 1 pregnancy, a fact she has told exactly one person outside her own household, her sister in Bath, and one that sits quietly, permanently in the private part of her life that never comes up in conversation. This was, in the Victorian world, an entirely common experience and an entirely silent one. The formality that governed so much of this life governed grief as well. You carried it. You did not speak of it. Eventually, it simply became part of who you were. Let's talk about what wealthy Victorian women actually read, because this is one of the areas where popular imagination gets things most badly wrong. There's a persistent, lazy picture of the Victorian lady reading nothing more demanding than sentimental romance novels and fashion periodicals. And while those things certainly existed and certainly found readers, it's a poor description of women moving in circles like Margaret's, circles that touched, even at a slight remove, the worlds of law, politics, and increasingly, through conversations like tonight's with Eleanor Reed, contested questions about women's own place in society. Women in Margaret's world read novels, yes, but often genuinely demanding ones. Middlemarch, which Margaret has been rereading all day, is not light entertainment. It asks real patience of its reader, and a willingness to sit with discomfort and moral complexity rather than being handed easy resolutions. George Eliot's work was widely read and widely discussed in precisely the circles Margaret moves through, and the fact that Eliot was a woman writing under a male pen name, a fact everyone in these circles knew perfectly well, was itself a live and interesting subject of conversation, a small, constant reminder of exactly the tension between women's capability and women's permitted sphere that we've been circling all evening. They read history, particularly the kind of accessible popular history that connected the past directly to live political and social debates of the present. They read philosophy at varying levels of technical depth. John Stuart Mill's more accessible essays carried particular weight in this period, and Mill's On the Subjection of Women, published in 1869, had made an argument that felt immediately, personally relevant to every thinking woman who encountered it, and had sparked a conversation that was still very much alive 12 years later, running underneath exactly the kind of exchange Margaret had with Eleanor Reed over dinner tonight. They read science, largely through periodical essays and popular accounts of recent discoveries rather than technical papers themselves. They read political economy, the subject with perhaps the most direct bearing on the social questions of the day. They read poetry, not the decorative luxury it can sound like from a modern vantage point, but the dominant serious art form of the era, discussed and argued over with the kind of intensity we might now reserve for prestige television or serious contemporary fiction. Crucially, this reading happened almost entirely in the gaps, in the half hour before a morning call, in the 35 minutes between a fitting and the start of evening preparations, in the 15 quiet minutes before sleep. Women carried books and periodicals with them on carriage journeys. They annotated margins. They corresponded with friends about what they were reading, and this correspondence, an extension of exactly the kind of letter writing we watched Margaret do this morning, became one of the primary channels through which serious ideas actually circulated inside women's social networks, running parallel to and largely invisible from the world of male public discourse. None of this reading led anywhere professionally. None of it produced advancement, credentials, or income. But it was real intellectual life, seriously pursued, and it produced women who could hold their own at exactly the kind of dinner-table conversation Margaret navigated tonight with a client's outspoken wife. Now, Margaret is one version of the wealthy Victorian woman's life, but she is by no means the only version, and it's worth widening the frame briefly to see some of the range. At one end of the spectrum sat the aristocratic woman, the wife or daughter of a peer, living inside a world of considerably greater formality and considerably greater wealth than Margaret's. The great aristocratic households of Victorian England, the country estates and grand London townhouses of dukes and earls, operated on a scale that makes even a comfortable establishment like the Whitfields look genuinely modest by comparison. A staff of 30 or 40 rather than 6. Houses built around ballrooms, picture galleries, libraries, entire wings given over to entertaining. A dinner party of 12 guests, which for Margaret would represent a major, carefully planned event, might be considered by a duchess a small and almost casual gathering. Women in these households had, in certain respects, more freedom than Margaret. The sheer scale of the establishment meant more tasks could be genuinely delegated to specialized staff, leaving more time that was, at least in theory, unclaimed. In other respects they had considerably less freedom, since the social obligations of the aristocracy were even more relentlessly public, even more thoroughly observed and judged, and the cost of any visible misstep, a poorly run dinner, an ill-considered match for a daughter, Any hint that the household wasn't operating at the expected standard was proportionately far larger. At the other end of the upper-class spectrum sat the women of what the period sometimes called, not always kindly, the new money, families whose wealth came from industry, manufacturing, or trade rather than land or a long-established profession. These women were in some ways the most interesting of all because they were building respectability from scratch rather than inheriting it. They had money, and they urgently needed social position to match it, and they generally worked far harder and far more consciously to acquire that position than women born directly into Margaret's world ever had to. The advice manuals of the period, the ones laying out exactly what to spend on clothing, on entertaining, on cards and calls, were written above all for these women, who could not simply absorb the unwritten rules through a lifetime of quiet immersion the way Margaret had. There's something both admirable and quietly melancholy in this position. Enormous effort spent acquiring, rule by explicit rule, a social fluency that women born into Margaret's world acquired essentially by breathing, without ever having to consciously learn which conventions truly mattered and which were merely surface decoration. A distinction, as it happens, that can genuinely only be learned by growing up inside the system in the first place. It's worth pausing, too, on the real pleasures this life contained, because an evening built entirely around obligation and invisible labor would give a lopsided picture of what women like Margaret actually experienced day to day. There was music. The domestic music-making culture of Victorian drawing rooms produced an extraordinary depth of genuine skill that has largely disappeared from popular memory. Women who played piano in households like Margaret's were often playing seriously, working through real, demanding repertoire, Chopin, Schumann, Schubert, rather than simply producing polite background noise, and the years of dedicated practice behind that skill represented genuine achievement, however rarely it was described that way. There was the countryside, the weeks in Scotland, the country house visits, real access to landscape and quiet and physical space that stood in sharp contrast to the compressed, scheduled intensity of London life. There was friendship, the female social world of Victorian Britain, for all its rigid codes and its constant undertone of quiet competition, was also, genuinely, a world of real female friendship and mutual support. The correspondence we watched Margaret write this morning wasn't purely obligation. The warmth in some of those letters, particularly the one to her sister, was entirely real. And within a good marriage, and by most available evidence, Margaret and Charles's marriage is a genuinely good one. There was real partnership, intellectual companionship, real emotional intimacy, the kind of easy late-night conversation we watched the two of them share after the Reeds left tonight. The formal legal structure of Victorian marriage, in which a wife's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's, in which she could own very little property in her own right and had no vote and remained socially dependent on his position, was genuinely unjust, and calling it exactly that is simply accurate. But inside that unjust structure, real human beings built real, complicated, often genuinely loving relationships. The structure was wrong. The people living inside it were still, unmistakably human. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. Margaret's single day in November of 1881 sits inside a much longer story, and it's worth stepping back now to see the whole shape of it, because the Victorian era, technically speaking, runs a full 64 years, from Victoria's coronation in 1837 to her death in 1901. And a wealthy woman's daily life changed meaningfully across that span, even as its underlying structure of invisible labor and narrow permitted freedom stayed remarkably constant. In the earlier decades of the era, the social world Margaret would recognize was still being actively assembled. The elaborate calling card system we watched her navigate this morning was newer, still being codified into the rigid unwritten rules it would become by the 1880s. The London season existed, but in a somewhat less tightly structured form. And the enormous industry of household advice literature, that would eventually shape how women like Margaret understood their own role, hadn't yet fully arrived. That industry exploded through the 1850s and 1860s, and its single most famous product, Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861, is worth mentioning specifically, because it's often remembered today as simply a cookbook when it was in fact something considerably larger. A comprehensive guide to running an entire Victorian household, in which the recipes make up only one section among many chapters on staff management, household accounts, medical emergencies, and the proper conduct of a household's mistress. Mrs. Beeton opens the book, before a single recipe appears, by comparing the well-run household to an army and its mistress to the general commanding it, a comparison she clearly did not intend as a light metaphor. The book sold more than 60,000 copies in its first year alone, and went through edition after edition for the following half-century, sitting on the shelf of nearly every household at Margaret's level or above, shaping, whether consciously followed or not, exactly what a well-run household was expected to look like, and exactly what its mistress was expected to be doing with every hour of her day. Moving forward from Margaret's own moment in 1881, the 1880s and 1890s brought a genuine intensification of what historians now call the New Woman debate, the broad, increasingly public cultural argument over whether women should have real access to higher education, professional employment, physical freedom, and eventually political participation, extending well beyond anything the earlier Victorian world had seriously imagined. This wasn't an abstract argument confined to periodicals and lecture halls. It was playing out in the actual, specific lives of real women, including women very much like Margaret and Eleanor Reed. The generation of women who entered Girton and Newnham in the 1870s and early 1880s were, by the later 1880s, beginning to move into a genuinely new set of professional roles, chiefly teaching, nursing, and a limited, hard-fought entry into medicine, and their simple existence functioned as a constant, quiet provocation to the existing social order, since they demonstrated in the most direct and undeniable way possible that women could do exactly the things the prevailing social consensus had insisted, often with confident pseudo-medical backing, that they could not or should not do. The organized women's suffrage movement, which had begun assembling seriously through the 1860s and 1870s, was by the 1880s a real and growing presence in British public life. Women were increasingly writing publicly under their own names about their own legal and social position, and the volume of that public conversation was steadily rising. For a woman like Margaret, intelligent, genuinely engaged with the ideas of her time, married to a man whose career she has spent this entire day quietly, invisibly advancing. This is not a distant, abstract debate. It carries a real personal dimension, even if Margaret herself has never quite put that dimension into so many words. She has run a household with genuine executive competence for 6 years and received, for that competence, no institutional credit of any kind. She holds her own, effortlessly, in serious conversation with an outspoken shipping merchant's wife about women's education, and that capability has, and will likely continue to have, no professional outlet whatsoever beyond the walls of her own drawing room. She has opinions on women's education, and increasingly, on women's suffrage that sit somewhat further forward than her own social position, makes entirely comfortable to voice too loudly at a dinner table. She would not, in 1881, use the word feminist. It hasn't yet entered common English usage and won't for another decade or more, but she is, without ever naming it as such, part of the broad current that will eventually produce the full suffrage campaigns of the early 20th century. The campaign her own daughter Alice, 5 years old tonight, asleep upstairs in the nursery, will live to see partly succeed in 1918, and fully succeed a decade after that. In 1928, it's worth naming briefly some of the individual women this era actually produced, because Margaret's representative, ordinary life makes far more sense once set alongside the genuine exceptions. The Victorian era produced Florence Nightingale, who essentially built the modern nursing profession from scratch and permanently changed the relationship between medicine and public health in ways that saved enormous numbers of lives well beyond Britain's own borders. It produced George Eliot herself. The author of the very novel Margaret has been quietly rereading all day, whose fiction remains among the finest achievements in the English language. It produced Barbara Bodichon, who helped found Girton College and argued publicly, persistently, and at real personal cost for women's legal rights over property and marriage. It produced Octavia Hill, who effectively invented the field of organized social housing, and with it, much of what would become modern social work. It produced Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who became the first woman to formally qualify as a physician in Britain, dismantling the barriers in front of her one at a time through sheer persistence. None of these women are Margaret. They are women who found, through some combination of extraordinary individual talent, unusually supportive circumstances, real personal determination, and no small amount of historical good fortune, an actual route out of the drawing room and into wider public life. Their stories matter and deserve to be told in full, but they are, by definition, the exceptional cases. Margaret is the representative one, and what Margaret's ordinary, competently managed, largely uncelebrated day represents is the real norm underneath those exceptional stories. Extraordinary skill, applied daily and without complaint to a deliberately narrow sphere. A genuinely capable mind bent toward the only work available to it. A woman doing everything asked of her correctly, gracefully, and often brilliantly, inside a structure that had no vocabulary yet for what correctly and brilliantly actually meant when a woman was the one doing it. Let's close the day properly, back where we started in the quiet dark of the Whitfield house. It's nearly 1 in the morning now. The house is fully still. The last coal in Margaret's bedroom grate has settled into ash. Outside, the fog that hung over the square this morning has thickened again into a soft, damp November night, broken only by the gas lamp on the corner and the pale wash of a moon somewhere behind the cloud. Somewhere in this house, 6 other people are asleep, or very nearly so, Alice and Edmund upstairs in the nursery with Sarah nearby, Bridget in the small room off the dressing room, Mrs. Doyle and the kitchen maid down in the basement quarters, the parlor maid and the manservant in their own rooms under the roof. Every one of them will be awake and at work again before Margaret opens her eyes tomorrow, quietly setting in motion the machinery that will let her morning proceed as smoothly as this one did. A machinery so well run, so carefully invisible, that any visitor to this house would swear it simply runs itself. Margaret is asleep in her own bed, under good linen, with the window cracked slightly for the fresh air the health manuals of the period universally recommend. Her hair is braided for the night. Her skin carries the faint trace of last night's cold cream. The pearl necklace sits back in its case on the dressing table. The wine velvet evening bodice hangs on its form in the wardrobe, checked and ready to be sent down for cleaning in the morning. Downstairs, on the small mahogany writing desk in the morning room, the leather notebook sits closed, with 3 items already written on tomorrow's page in Margaret's own clear, unhurried hand. She will wake at 6:30. She will ring for Bridget at 20 past. The day will begin again, nearly identical in its shape to the one we've just spent together, and entirely different in its particulars. A new letter to answer, a new caller to receive, a new small crisis to absorb calmly and solve before anyone upstairs even notices it happened. This is the wealthy Victorian woman's life, not the still portrait on the wall, not the fairy tale of idle silk-dressed leisure, but the real one. The 13 pounds of engineered clothing worn from before dawn until well past midnight, the 4 letters written before 11 in the morning, the household emergency solved in 20 quiet minutes in a kitchen doorway, the dinner table conversation about women's education handled with a diplomat's precision, The half hour with middle mark that said something different at 29 than it did at 22. And underneath every part of it, the quiet, entirely uncredited competence of a woman running a small, complicated enterprise with genuine skill, day after day, inside a world that had built no proper vocabulary for calling what she did by its real name. She looks, in the museum portrait some painter might make of a woman exactly like her, composed and remote and perfectly arranged. She was always underneath that, considerably more than that. The lamp on the corner is still burning. The street is quiet. Sleep well, my friend. We've been somewhere real tonight. Let's go back now and look more closely at the people who made Margaret's day possible, the household staff themselves, because their lives are just as much a part of this story as hers, and popular Victorian history tends to erase them almost as thoroughly as it erases the invisible labor of women like Margaret, only from the opposite direction. Take Bridget first, since she spent more hours in Margaret's company today than anyone else, including Charles. Bridget is 22, the third of 6 children born to a tenant farming family in County Clare, Ireland. She came to England at 17, following an older sister who had already secured a position in service in Liverpool, and worked her way up through 2 lesser households, first as a kitchen maid, then as an under-housemaid, before landing the position of lady's maid with the Whitfields 3 years ago, a genuine step up in both wages and status within the tightly ranked world of domestic service. Her wages, as we mentioned earlier, sit somewhere around £24 a year, paid quarterly, out of which she is expected to provide her own small personal items, though her uniforms and board are covered by the household. She sends a portion of her wages home to Ireland every quarter without fail, a fact Margaret knows and has never once commented on, though she has, on 2 occasions, quietly arranged for Bridget's quarterly pay to arrive a few days early when Bridget mentioned, carefully and indirectly, that money was needed at home sooner than usual. Bridget's day, if we were to follow it the way we've followed Margaret's, would look considerably different in shape but scarcely less demanding in substance. She rises before 6, well before Margaret rings for her, in order to have hot water ready, the previous day's clothes brushed and put away, and the dressing table arranged precisely to Margaret's preference before the first bell of the morning. Her work continues, in one form or another, until well past midnight most nights, since a lady's maid's duties don't truly end until her mistress is finally undressed and asleep. She has, technically, 1 half-day off a week and alternate Sunday afternoons for church and her own errands, a genuine privilege by the standards of domestic service more broadly, though it leaves her with considerably less unclaimed time in a week than Margaret has managed to claim in this single day we've just spent together. The relationship between Margaret and Bridget is one of the more quietly complicated dynamics running underneath everything we've watched tonight. It is not, by any honest measure, a relationship between equals, the difference in power, in wages, in freedom, in whose comfort the whole arrangement exists to serve, is total and never seriously in question. And it is also, within those unequal terms, a relationship of real intimacy, built out of literally thousands of hours spent in close physical proximity, doing intensely personal work. Bridget knows Margaret's body, her moods, her small vanities and worries, in a way almost no one else in Margaret's life does, Charles included. Margaret, for her part, generally treats Bridget with real consideration, within the limits her own social world allows her to imagine. She asks after Bridget's family, remembers small details Bridget has mentioned in passing, and would be genuinely troubled by the suggestion that she treated Bridget carelessly. She has also never once in 3 years thought to ask Bridget what Bridget herself might actually want out of her own life, beyond the narrow question of whether her current position suits her. The blindness here is not cruelty. It is simply the shape of the world both women were raised inside, a world with an entirely developed vocabulary for describing what a good mistress owed a good servant, and almost none at all for imagining the servant as a person with her own unrelated hopes running independently of the household she serves. Mrs. Doyle, the cook, occupies a rather different position in the household's internal hierarchy, considerably more senior than Bridget, both in age and in the practical authority she wields over her own domain. She is 51, widowed young, with 2 grown children she raised largely on a cook's wages while working in a series of increasingly good households across 3 decades of service. She commands the kitchen with an authority that even Margaret, technically her employer, is careful never to override without real cause. Mrs. Doyle's judgment on menus, on suppliers, on the proper handling of tonight's dinner party crisis, is trusted almost completely, and the conference we described at 8:30 this morning, however casual it looks on the surface, is in practice a negotiation between 2 competent professionals who each understand exactly how much authority the other genuinely holds. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it complicates the picture we've been building all evening of Margaret as the household's sole administrator. In practice, a house like this one runs on a kind of distributed authority, with Margaret holding the final word on nearly everything, but delegating enormous practical judgment to Mrs. Doyle in the kitchen, to Bridget in matters of dress and appearance, and to the housekeeper role that, in a slightly larger establishment than the Whitfields, would exist as its own separate position but here is absorbed partly into Margaret's own responsibilities and partly, informally, into Mrs. Doyle's broader seniority among the female staff. Let's turn now to a different kind of day than the one we spent with Margaret, a quieter one, because the extraordinary day we followed, the one with the last-minute dinner crisis and the client whose goodwill might shape a career, was not, in fact, typical. It's worth walking through an ordinary Tuesday as well, because the contrast tells us something the dramatic day cannot. On a quiet Tuesday in late October, 3 weeks before the evening we've already spent with Margaret, there is no crisis, no important client, no fitting at Madame Ceylan's. Margaret wakes at the same hour, goes through the same 90-minute morning routine with Bridget, holds the same conference with Mrs. Doyle, spends the same half hour with her children. But the middle of the day looks different. There is one morning call to make rather than receive. A courtesy visit to an elderly aunt of Charles's who lives 2 streets over and expects, without ever quite stating it as an expectation, a visit from Margaret roughly every 3 weeks. The visit takes 20 minutes and consists mostly of the aunt, a sharp-tongued widow named Mrs. Prentice, delivering opinions on the declining standards of London society, opinions Margaret has heard in close to identical form on every previous visit and receives, each time, with the same practiced patience. The afternoon is given over entirely to correspondence and to the Charity Committee's monthly meeting, held this month in Margaret's own drawing room, with 6 other women gathered around the tea table working through the practical business of an upcoming fundraising bazaar. Who will supply what baked goods? Who has agreed to run which stall? Whether the vicar's wife's proposed venue is genuinely large enough for the crowd they're hopping to draw. This meeting runs closer to 90 minutes than the 15-minute snap of this morning's household conference, and it is, in its own way, exactly as much real administrative work, conducted with exactly as much seriousness, though it will never once be described using that language. In the evening, there is no dinner party at all, simply Charles and Margaret, alone at their own table, the 2 of them talking more freely and at greater length than the carefully managed conversational choreography of a formal dinner ever permits. Charles tells her about a genuinely difficult case he's working on, one where he's not confident of the outcome, and Margaret listens and asks the kind of informed, careful questions that 6 years of exactly this sort of conversation have trained her to ask. After dinner, Margaret plays the piano for the better part of an hour, not the practiced drawing room performance she'd offer to guests, but real, private practice, working through a Schubert piece she's been learning for weeks, stopping and starting and repeating a difficult passage until it finally sits correctly under her fingers. Charles reads by the fire and looks up now, and then when she plays something particularly well. At 10 they talk again, more about the children this time, about a decision looming regarding Alice's eventual governess. At 11 they go up, and the routine of undressing and the long brushing of hair proceeds much as it did on the dramatic evening we already watched, only without the residue of an important evening's tension behind it. These quieter Tuesdays make up, in raw numerical terms, the majority of Margaret's married life. Dramatic evenings like the one with the Reeds are memorable precisely because they're exceptional. And yet even the quiet Tuesday, look closely, contains an enormous amount of the same invisible labor we spent all of Part 1 through Part 8 examining. The morning routine, the household conference, the correspondence, the charity committee's real administrative work, the small courtesy call to an aunt who would notice, and mind its absence. The density of demand doesn't disappear on a quiet day. It simply becomes less visible, folded into a rhythm so consistent that neither Margaret nor anyone around her experiences it as remarkable at all. Let's widen the historical lens again and spend some real time on money. Not Margaret's household specifically this time, but the wider Victorian economy of women's dependence, because understanding the numbers at every level of society helps explain exactly why the invisible labor we've spent this whole evening documenting mattered so much, and why losing access to it, for a woman in Margaret's position, was so genuinely frightening a prospect. Under English common law through most of the Victorian era, a married woman's legal identity was governed by the doctrine of coverture, the principle that upon marriage, a woman's separate legal existence was, in the law's own phrase, covered by her husband's. In practical terms, this meant that any property Margaret brought into the marriage, any income she might theoretically earn, any money at all, belonged legally to Charles, not to her. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not sue or be sued independently. If Charles died without a will making specific provision for her, the law's default arrangements for a widow, while not leaving her destitute, gave her considerably less control over the household's assets than Charles exercised while alive. This began to change, gradually and incompletely, across the middle decades of the century. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 allowed married women to keep their own earnings and certain limited categories of property in their own name for the first time. A genuine, hard-won legal change, though a fairly narrow one in practice, since very few women in Margaret's social position had earnings of their own to protect in the first place. A further, considerably more significant Married Women's Property Act followed in 1882, the year after the day we've been following, which extended married women's rights to hold and control property considerably further, treating a married woman's property, for the first time, as legally her own rather than automatically her husband's. Margaret, reading about this act in the newspapers when it passes the following year, will follow the debate with real, personal interest, in a way that goes rather beyond polite social awareness. This legal backdrop explains something important about the particular flavor of anxiety we noted earlier in Margaret's relationship to money and household management. She manages the household accounts with real skill and real daily authority. And underneath that authority sits a legal reality in which none of it is technically, formally hers. Not the house, not the furniture, not even strictly the wages she pays Bridget and Mrs. Doyle out of an allowance Charles provides and could, in principle, though he never would, simply withdraw. The competence is real. The underlying vulnerability is equally real, and it never entirely leaves the background of a marriage otherwise built, as Margaret and Charles's genuinely is, on real mutual respect. Widowhood, for women without independent means, was one of the great genuine terrors running underneath the polished surface of upper-middle-class Victorian life, precisely the terror that the charity Margaret volunteers for exists to address. A woman widowed young, without children old enough to support her, without property in her own name, without any recognized profession she could turn to, could fall from genuine comfort into genuine hardship with alarming speed. This is why the charities work matters so much to Margaret personally, and why she takes the committee meetings we described in Part 10 as seriously as she does. She has watched it happen, at one remove, to women she knows. Let's talk in more depth now about fashion across the Victorian decades, since the single dress we watched Margaret constructed into this morning represents only one moment in a silhouette that shifted, sometimes dramatically, across the 64 years of the era, and understanding those shifts tells its own story about changing ideas of what a respectable woman's body should look like. In the 1840s, at the very start of Victoria's reign, the fashionable silhouette was considerably narrower through the skirt than it would later become, bell-shaped rather than the extreme width of later decades, with sloping shoulders and a low, pointed waistline that emphasized a soft, rounded femininity quite different from what Margaret wears in 1881. Hair was worn close to the head, parted center, often looped low over the ears. The overall effect, by later Victorian standards, reads as almost demure. The 1850s and especially the 1860s brought the crinoline age. The enormous cage-framed skirts, built on flexible steel hoops, that could extend 6 feet or more in diameter at their most extreme, an engineering solution to the simple problem that achieving equivalent width through layered petticoats alone had become nearly impossible to walk in. The crinoline, whatever it looks like to modern eyes, was in its own context something of a practical improvement. A woman wearing one carried considerably less actual weight than her mother had carried in a decade's worth of stacked petticoats, even though the visual effect was, if anything, more dramatic. Caricaturists of the period had an endless field day with the crinoline's genuine practical hazards. Women unable to fit through doorways, skirts catching fire from an unnoticed hearth, the sheer difficulty of managing a crinoline in a crowded carriage. And a good number of these hazards were entirely real rather than comic exaggeration. By the early 1870s, the crinoline had begun collapsing at the front, with volume migrating toward the back of the skirt in the transitional shape that would eventually become the bustle. Precisely what we saw on Margaret's morning dress, with its half-cage crinolet and padded bustle producing a relatively flat front and a dramatic rearward shelf. This shape would dominate fashionable dress through most of the 1870s and into the early 1880s, though the bustle itself would grow, shrink, and reshape itself several times across those years. The exaggerated shelf bustle of the very early 1870s giving way to a somewhat softer, more naturally draped silhouette by mid-decade, before swinging back toward an even more pronounced bustle shape in the mid-1880s. A few years after the moment we've spent tonight inside. By the 1890s, the bustle would disappear almost entirely, replaced by the leg of mutton sleeve and a fuller, more athletic-looking silhouette that coincided, not by accident, with the era of the bicycle and the broader cultural shift toward greater physical freedom for women that we touched on earlier. And by the very end of the century, moving into the Edwardian period beyond Victoria's own reign, the silhouette would soften again into the flowing, corseted S-bend shape associated with the early 1900s. What's worth taking from this whole 60-year sweep is not simply that fashion changed, fashion always changes, but that the underlying logic never really did. In every decade, the fashionable silhouette required specific, often expensive, often physically significant underlying structure to achieve, and a woman of Margaret's class was expected to keep pace with that structure's evolution regardless of cost or inconvenience, because failing to keep pace was not read as thrift or eccentricity, but as a genuine social failure, evidence that the household could not, or would not, maintain the standard its position required. Let's go back once more to the day itself, and add something we passed over quickly earlier, the question of what Margaret and Charles's marriage actually looked like at its foundation, since it explains a great deal about the ease with which the two of them navigated tonight's dinner party crisis together. Margaret and Charles married in 1875, when she was 23 and he was 28, in a match arranged with considerably more input from both of them personally than an earlier generation might have allowed, though arranged, in the sense that both families were closely involved in bringing the match about, checking financial and social suitability before either young person had much chance to develop strong feelings one way or the other. They had been introduced at a dance the previous winter through a mutual family connection, had danced twice, had been seated near each other at a dinner party a few weeks later engineered, transparently, by both mothers, and had reached what both families considered a satisfactory understanding within about 4 months. This is worth pausing on, because it complicates any simple modern reading of Victorian marriage as either purely romantic or purely transactional. It was, in practice, usually both at once, in proportions that varied enormously from couple to couple. Margaret's own parents made clear, gently but unmistakably, that Charles represented a genuinely good match, a rising professional man with real prospects, from a respectable if not especially wealthy family, close enough in social standing to Margaret's own family that no one would raise an eyebrow. Margaret, for her part, found Charles genuinely likable from their very first conversation, intelligent, a little more willing than most young men of his set to actually listen when she spoke rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. And by the time the engagement was formally settled, she had, by her own private account many years later, arrived at something considerably warmer than mere resignation to a sensible match. 6 years into the marriage, by the November evening we spent with them, that early warmth has settled into something steadier, and, in its own way, deeper, the easy, practiced partnership visible in the 10 minutes they spent talking after the Reeds left, in Charles's willingness to take Margaret's read of Alina Reed seriously as genuine professional intelligence rather than idle social gossip, in the quiet comfort of the piano evening we described in Part 10. This is not, it's worth being honest, a universal outcome of Victorian arranged courtship. Plenty of marriages contracted on similar terms across this same social world settled into something considerably colder or worse. Margaret and Charles's marriage is, by the standards of their own world, a genuinely fortunate one, not because either of them did anything unusual to make it so, particularly, but because the underlying compatibility that the matchmaking process is designed to identify happened, in their case, to actually be there. Let's return, for a longer stretch now, to the wider question of Victorian domestic service, since we've mentioned Bridget and Mrs. Doyle, but haven't yet given the full scale of this world its due. By the 1880s, domestic service was, by a wide margin, the single largest category of paid employment for women in Britain, considerably larger than factory work, larger than any form of retail or clerical work, larger than every other female occupation combined. Something in the range of 1.5 million women were in domestic service across the country at any given time during this period, ranging from the single maid of all work, employed by a modest lower middle-class household, doing every task in the house essentially alone, up through the elaborate, highly specialized staffs of 30 or 40, employed by the great aristocratic houses we touched on in Part 7. A household exactly at Margaret's level, 6 servants, a comfortable professional family, sat roughly in the middle of this enormous range. The hierarchy within domestic service was itself intricate and closely guarded. A lady's maid like Bridget occupied a position of real status among household staff, considerably above a general housemaid, and servants were, in most households, acutely conscious of these internal rankings, even when the family upstairs remained largely oblivious to them. Meals below stairs were often taken in a specific order reflecting this hierarchy, with senior staff eating separately from junior staff, and even small questions of address, who called whom by their first name, who used a formal surname, carried real social weight within the servant's own world. The work itself, across the ranks, was physically demanding in ways that the conference we watched Mrs. Doyle hold with Margaret this morning doesn't fully convey. A housemaid's day began before 5 in the morning in winter, laying and lighting fires in every occupied room before the family woke, and continued through a punishing list of tasks: sweeping, dusting, carrying hot water up multiple flights of stairs repeatedly through the day, cleaning grates, polishing brass and silver, making beds, emptying chamber pots, that left very little time for rest before the day ended, often past 10 at night. Servants' own bedrooms, typically in the attic or basement depending on rank, were sparsely furnished and often poorly heated, a sharp contrast to the well-appointed rooms they spent their days maintaining for the family upstairs. And yet domestic service, for many young working-class women, represented a genuinely better option than the available alternatives: factory work, agricultural labor, or the various forms of casual and often precarious employment open to women without capital or connections. Service provided secure lodging and food, a fixed wage paid reliably, and for an ambitious and capable woman like Bridget, at least the possibility of rising through the ranks toward a position like lady's maid or, eventually, housekeeper, a genuine career ladder, however narrow, within a world that offered working women very few genuine career ladders of any kind. Let's turn to something we've referenced several times, but not yet examined directly: the specific mechanics of Victorian letter writing and correspondence as a social technology, since it's easy to underestimate just how much cultural machinery sat behind the 4 letters Margaret wrote at her desk this morning. By 1881, Britain's postal system was, by international standards, remarkably efficient, a legacy of the uniform penny post reform of 1840, which had standardized postage at a flat, low rate regardless of distance, and revolutionized the volume of mail moving through the country. In London specifically, multiple postal deliveries and collections ran through the day, often 6 or more separate collections, meaning a letter posted in the morning might genuinely receive a reply by evening of the same day, a level of same-day responsiveness that made written correspondence function almost like a slower version of later telephone conversation. This mattered enormously for exactly the social world we've been examining all evening. The elaborate rules of Victorian correspondence etiquette that governed Margaret's morning letter writing session weren't simply arbitrary formality. They were the practical rules of a genuinely functioning communication network, with its own equivalent of what a later era would call response time expectations. A letter requiring a reply within a reasonable time. In 1880, one genuinely meant within a day or two, not because the technology was slow and forgiving, but because it was fast enough that delay itself became a legible social signal. The physical materials of correspondence carried their own layer of meaning. Margaret's writing paper, ordered specially from a stationer near Charles's chambers, was chosen deliberately. A particular weight and quality of cream paper, a particular style of monogram or address printed at the top, all of it communicating something about the household's taste and standing before a single word of the letter itself had been read. Sealing wax, ink quality, even the steadiness and elegance of the handwriting itself, all of these were read, consciously or not, by recipients as evidence of the writer's breeding and attentiveness. Margaret's clear, practiced hand, drilled into her as a girl by her own governess through years of repeated exercises, is not incidental to her social competence. It is, in its own quiet way, part of the same visible performance of correctness that governs her dress, her drawing room, and her dinner table. Letters were also, in this period, frequently retained, reread, and sometimes shared. A letter from a close friend might be read aloud in part to another visitor, or kept in a correspondence box for years and revisited. This gives Victorian letter writing a slightly different character than a modern reader might assume from its formal surface. It was not simply a series of disposable social transactions, but a genuine, cumulative archive of relationships, one that women in particular relied on to maintain friendships and family connections across the physical distances that marriage, in a highly mobile professional class, tended to create. Let's spend some time now on a subject we've only touched briefly. What actually happened to children like Alice and Edmund as they grew older within a household like this one? Because the invisible labor we've spent all evening documenting didn't end with early childhood, it simply changed shape. For a boy like Edmund, the trajectory from this point forward was fairly well established within families of the Whitfield's social position. Until around 8, he would remain largely in the nursery's orbit, moving gradually from Sarah's care toward lessons with a tutor, or, more commonly by this point in the century, preparation for entry into a preparatory boarding school. Margaret and Charles have already begun, in the kind of low-key ongoing conversation that runs underneath a marriage like theirs, discussing which school might eventually suit Edmund, a decision that carries real financial weight, since school fees for a boy destined eventually for one of the older public schools, and then possibly university, represented one of the largest single expenses a family at this income level would face over the coming 15 years. This is, worth noting, an expense that exists specifically because Edmund is a boy. Alice's education, however seriously Margaret takes it, will never carry anything like this same financial or social weight, precisely because the world Alice is being raised for has no equivalent institutional ladder waiting at the far end of it. For Alice, the path runs differently. Assuming the family's fortunes continue on their current trajectory, she will likely remain under a governess's instruction at home until somewhere around 16 or 17, learning much the same curriculum we described in Part 5. French, music, drawing, a general education in literature and history, alongside the practical training in household management and social conduct that will eventually let her run a household of her own exactly as competently as Margaret runs this one. Around 17, she will be formally brought out into society, presented at a series of events designed to establish her, gently and gradually, as eligible for marriage. And from that point until she marries, her life will resemble, in miniature, the elaborate calendar of morning calls and dinners and seasonal migration that fills her mother's own year, except conducted always under her mother's close supervision, and always, ultimately, oriented toward securing a good match. Margaret thinks about this trajectory more than she generally lets on, and it's worth being honest that her feelings about it are not entirely settled. She wants, in the most straightforward sense, for Alice to be happy and well provided for, and she genuinely believes most days that the life she herself leads, however demanding, however invisible its labor remains, is a good one, full of real satisfactions alongside its real constraints. And there is, running quietly underneath that belief, the same current we identified back in Part 8, an awareness, not fully articulated even to herself, that the world reshaping itself around the Girton students and the suffrage debates might, by the time Alice is grown, offer her daughter genuinely different choices than the ones Margaret herself was ever offered. She does not know, in November of 1881, what those choices will eventually look like. She simply carries, alongside everything else she carries through this long day, a kind of watchful curiosity about what her own daughter's version of this life might eventually become. Let's return to the household finances one more time, because there's a category of expense we haven't yet examined closely: the cost, both financial and social, of a family's position relative to the households immediately above and below them on the social ladder. What historians sometimes call the problem of keeping pace, and which shaped an enormous amount of the quiet daily calculation running underneath Margaret's management of the house. Directly above the Whitfields on Belgravia's own informal social ladder sits a family like the Aldertons, Mrs. Alderton, whose morning call we watched in Part 3, and her husband, a considerably more established barrister than Charles, with an income perhaps double the Whitfields' own. The Aldertons keep a staff of 9 rather than 6. Their carriage is a more elaborate landau rather than a modest brougham. Mrs. Alderton's dress allowance runs to something closer to £250 a year, against Margaret's 100 to 150. None of this is discussed directly between the two women. Ever, Victorian social etiquette made a point of never openly comparing household budgets, even between close friends. But Margaret is nonetheless acutely, continuously aware of the gap, and manages her own household with half an eye on it, calibrating exactly how far she can stretch toward the Alderton standard of entertaining without either overspending dangerously or, just as importantly, underspending in a way that might read as thrift rather than genuine limitation. Below the Whitfields sit families like that of a young solicitor's clerk 2 streets over, recently married, keeping a staff of only 2 and no carriage at all, walking or taking a hansom cab whenever they need to travel any distance. Margaret is friendly, in a careful, measured way, with the clerk's wife, a woman named Mrs. Fenwick, but the friendship operates within clear if unspoken limits. Margaret would not, for instance, invite the Fenwicks to a dinner alongside guests like the Reeds, not out of any personal unkindness, but because doing so would create a genuinely awkward mismatch of social expectation on both sides, the kind of mismatch Victorian hostessing worked very hard to avoid. This entire structure, households constantly, quietly measuring their own position against the households just above and just below them, adjusting spending and entertaining and even friendship itself to match, produced an enormous amount of what economists studying the period have called positional or status-driven spending. Money spent not for any direct comfort or pleasure it provided, but purely to maintain a household's position relative to its neighbors. The advice manuals of the period, with their careful, itemized breakdowns of exactly what a household at each income level ought to spend on clothing and entertaining, were in this light, not simply practical guides. They were attempts to formalize and stabilize a competition that, left entirely to its own devices, had a real tendency to spiral families spending beyond their genuine means in an attempt to keep pace with neighbors who were, in turn, doing exactly the same thing. Let's spend some real time now on the subject of Victorian medicine, as Margaret and her household would actually have encountered it day to day. Since our earlier discussion in Part 6 touched on the larger ideological questions, but skipped past the practical, everyday reality of what seeing a doctor actually meant in 1881. The Whitfield family's physician, a Dr. Alfred Marsh, is a general practitioner in the modern sense, trained, licensed, respected within the neighborhood, but working with a body of medical knowledge that, from a later vantage point, mixed genuine and increasingly scientific understanding with a great deal of practice that would eventually be revised or discarded entirely. Germ theory, as we mentioned, was by 1881 becoming increasingly accepted within serious medical circles, following the work of scientists across the previous 2 decades, but its practical implications, the systematic use of antiseptic technique, for instance, were still spreading unevenly through general medical practice, adopted more quickly in some hospitals and by some individual doctors than others. For a household like the Whitfields, a visit from Dr. Marsh was not a routine, low-stakes event the way a doctor's visit might be today. It was called for specifically when household remedies and Margaret's own accumulated experience proved insufficient, a child's fever that persisted longer than expected, a cough that seemed to be settling into something more serious, an injury beyond what a household medical guide could confidently address. Dr. Marsh's fee for a single visit ran to somewhere between 2 and 5 shillings, depending on the complexity of the case, a sum that, while not devastating to a household at the Whitfields' income level, was enough that families further down the social scale genuinely hesitated before calling a doctor at all, often waiting until an illness had progressed considerably further than a wealthier family would have tolerated. The medicines Dr. Marsh might prescribe came from a pharmacopoeia that mixed real, effective treatments with others we would now recognize as having little or no genuine medical value. Quinine for fever, genuinely effective and well understood by this point. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, prescribed with a casualness that reflects just how normalized opiate use was throughout Victorian medicine, for everything from a child's teething pain to a grown woman's nervous complaints, with essentially no understanding yet of the addiction risk that would eventually reshape how such substances were regulated. Various tonics and restoratives, many containing genuinely active ingredients, others closer to expensive placebo, sold both by prescription and, increasingly through this period, directly to the public through patent medicine advertisements that filled the same newspapers Margaret reads each morning for news of Charles's parliamentary interests. Margaret's own approach to medicine sits at an interesting midpoint within this world. She trusts Dr. Marsh's professional judgment considerably more than she trusts the patent medicine advertisements she occasionally reads with an amused, slightly skeptical eye. But she also maintains her own considerable body of practical medical knowledge, built from experience and from the household medical guide sitting on the kitchen shelf. And she does not hesitate to override or supplement a doctor's advice with her own judgment when her direct experience with her own children suggests a different course. This kind of confident, practical medical competence, entirely unlicensed and entirely unrecognized by any formal institution, was, in fact, extremely common among women of Margaret's class and generation. Another instance, alongside household accounting and staff management, of genuine expert-level skill developed entirely outside any framework that would ever formally acknowledge it as expertise. Let's look now at a Sunday, since we've followed Margaret through a dramatic Tuesday and a quiet Tuesday both, and Sunday, in Victorian Britain, followed an entirely different rhythm from every other day of the week, one worth examining on its own terms. Margaret wakes at the same hour on Sunday morning, since the household's basic rhythms don't shift for the Sabbath, but the shape of the day that follows is markedly different. There is no morning conference with Mrs. Doyle in quite the same administrative register. Sunday's meals are simpler by long-standing convention, in part reflecting an older tradition of minimizing the kitchen staff's labor on the Sabbath, though by 1881 this convention has softened considerably from its earlier, stricter Victorian form. The family, staff included wherever their duties allow, attends morning service at the parish church a short walk from the house, a walk Margaret genuinely enjoys, one of the very few occasions in her week when she moves through the neighborhood on foot rather than by carriage, greeting neighbors and acquaintances along the way in a manner considerably more casual than the formal choreography of a morning call. Church itself carries its own layer of social performance alongside its genuine religious content. The Whitfield family's pew, positioned and priced according to a system that directly reflected social standing within the parish, the careful attention paid to who sits where and who nods to whom on the way in and out, the sermon itself, often touching, at least obliquely, on exactly the kinds of moral and social questions that fill Margaret's charity work and her private reading. Margaret's own religious faith is genuine, if not especially intense by the standards of the more fervently evangelical households in her wider social circle. She believes, in a straightforward, largely unexamined way, in the moral framework the Church provides, and she takes real, personal satisfaction in the charitable work that framework encourages, without spending a great deal of private time on theological questions beyond that practical application. The afternoon is genuinely quieter than any other day of Margaret's week. No calls are made or received on Sunday. This was one of the more strictly observed conventions of the calling card system, treated as close to inviolable. The family typically has a larger midday meal together, followed by an afternoon that might include a walk if the weather cooperates, quiet reading, letters to family members living further afield, or simply time spent together as a family in a way the rest of the week rarely permits. Alice and Edmund, on a good Sunday, spend considerably more unstructured time with both parents than any other day allows, and Margaret treasures these afternoons with a specific, quiet intensity that the rest of her carefully scheduled week doesn't leave much room for. By evening, a lighter supper, sometimes with a close family member or two invited rather than the wider social circle a weekday dinner might include, and an early night, Sunday in other words, functions as something close to a genuine day of rest within Margaret's otherwise relentlessly scheduled life, not entirely free of obligation, since the church attendance and its associated social performance remain real, but considerably closer to actual leisure than anything else her week contains. It's worth noting this contrast explicitly, because it helps clarify just how unusual genuine unstructured time was within Margaret's ordinary week. A single afternoon a week, more or less, that resembles what a later era would simply call free time. Everything else, across 6 full days, carries some form of scheduled obligation, however lightly some of those obligations sit. Let's turn now to a subject that connects directly to the dinner table exchange we watched between Margaret and Alina read back in Part 4. The actual public debate over women's higher education as it stood specifically in 1881, since it's worth giving this debate more precise historical shape than we've offered so far. By 1881, Girton College, which we mentioned had opened in 1869, and Newnham College, opened in 1875, were both firmly established, if still contested, presences within Cambridge's academic life. Women studying at these institutions sat the same tripos examinations as male undergraduates and were marked, informally, against the same standard, a fact that generated real controversy precisely because it kept producing results that undercut the era's confident assumptions about women's intellectual capacity. In 1880, the year before the evening we've spent with Margaret, a Girton student named Charlotte Angus Scott had sat the mathematical tripos and achieved a result that would have placed her 8th among all candidates, male and female, in the entire university that year. A result that could not, under the university's rules, be formally announced alongside the men's rankings, but that nonetheless became widely known and widely discussed. Precisely the kind of undeniable evidence that made the new woman debate impossible to simply dismiss as abstract theorizing. This is very likely, in fact, close to the specific news Margaret and Alina Reed's conversation at dinner touched on, even if our earlier account of the evening didn't name it explicitly. Charlotte Scott's result would have been exactly the sort of detail circulating through educated London social circles in late 1880 and through 1881, discussed in precisely the periodical press that Margaret reads each morning specifically to stay current for conversations like this one. The broader argument at this point in its development centered less on whether women could achieve academically at the same level as men. That question was, for anyone actually paying attention to results like Scott's, becoming increasingly difficult to argue in the negative, and more on what should follow from that fact. Should women be granted the same degrees for the same results? Cambridge's answer, which would remain unchanged for another 67 years, was no. Should women be permitted to pursue the professions those degrees would normally open doors to: law, medicine, the church, government service? Here the resistance ran even deeper, entangled with exactly the pseudo-medical anxieties about women's constitution we discussed in Part 6, and with a broader, largely unexamined cultural conviction that admitting women fully into professional life would somehow unravel the domestic arrangements, the households, the marriages, the entire social machinery we've spent this whole evening documenting, that Victorian society had built its confidence upon. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, whom we mentioned in Part 8, had by 1881 already spent more than a decade actively practicing medicine in London, having qualified through a technical loophole in French licensing requirements after British institutions refused to examine her, and having subsequently helped found what would become the London School of Medicine for Women in 1874, specifically to give other women a formal path into the profession that had so stubbornly excluded her. Her example was, by 1881, well known within exactly the social circles Margaret moves through, not universally admired, by any means, but impossible to entirely dismiss either, since she was, by any measure, a genuinely successful and respected physician treating real patients with real results. For Margaret personally, this whole debate occupies an interesting position. She has no serious professional ambitions of her own in any conventional sense. She was educated, married, and settled into exactly the domestic role we've spent this entire evening examining well before any of this debate had gathered its current momentum. And at 29, with 2 young children and a husband whose career depends substantially on her own daily labor, the question of whether she personally might have pursued something like medicine or the law is, for her, entirely theoretical. But the theoretical question interests her nonetheless, and it interests her specifically because of Alice, 5 years old and already showing, in her careful reading of picture books this very morning, the kind of concentrated attention that Margaret recognizes, with a mixture of pride and something more complicated, as very much her own. Let's spend some time now on a topic we've mentioned only briefly, the specific texture of the London that surrounds Margaret's house, the physical, sensory reality of the city itself in 1881, since it's easy, in focusing so closely on interior domestic life, to lose sight of the world just outside the front door. London in 1881 was, by a wide margin, the largest city in the world with a population approaching 4 million people, and it carried, quite literally, the atmospheric evidence of that scale. The coal smoke from hundreds of thousands of household grates and an expanding number of factories combined, in certain weather conditions, into the thick, yellow-tinged fog that Londoners had already, by this point, taken to calling a London particular. A phenomenon severe enough that on the worst days, visibility in the street could drop to a matter of yards, and that would, within living memory of people alive in 1881, occasionally kill vulnerable residents outright through sheer respiratory strain. The fog we described settling over Margaret's Square this morning was not simply atmospheric decoration for the story. It was a real, sometimes genuinely dangerous feature of London life that shaped everything from what time carriages could safely travel to which days were considered suitable for outdoor exercise. The streets themselves ran on horsepower in the most literal sense. The brougham that carries Margaret to her dressmakers shares the road with omnibuses, hansom cabs, private carriages, and heavy commercial drays, all of it drawn by horses whose sheer numbers created their own distinct environmental reality. Estimates from the period suggest London's horse population, cab and carriage and dray horses combined, likely exceeded 50,000 animals, each producing a significant daily quantity of manure that an army of street sweepers worked continuously, if never entirely successfully, to manage. The smell Margaret would have registered on stepping out her front door, horse, coal smoke, the specific mineral tang of London's water and drainage system before later sanitary reforms fully took hold, was intense and largely inescapable, though, like most residents, she would have stopped consciously noticing it years before the day we've been following. Gas lighting, which we mentioned illuminating the street outside Margaret's house both this morning and this midnight, had been standard across London's more prosperous districts for several decades by 1881, transforming what evening social life was practically possible in a way earlier generations, dependent on candlelight and oil lamps alone, would have found remarkable. Electric lighting existed by this point only in scattered, mostly commercial and experimental installations, It would not begin seriously displacing gas in London's better residential streets for another decade or more, meaning the warm, slightly unsteady orange glow of gas lamps that framed both the opening and closing of our evening with Margaret was, for her, simply what nighttime London looked like, rather than any deliberately old-fashioned atmospheric choice. Within this larger, smoky, gaslit, horse-powered city, a neighborhood like Belgravia functioned as a kind of carefully maintained island of relative order and cleanliness. The wide, regularly swept streets, the private garden squares accessible only to residents holding a key, the sheer density of household staff working continuously to keep dust and grime at bay, all of it a direct, physical expression of exactly the same status maintenance logic we examined in Part 17. The gap between the world just inside Margaret's front door and the world of London more broadly was not simply social. It was, in a very direct sense, a difference in air quality, noise level, and physical cleanliness that a contemporary visitor moving between neighborhoods would have registered immediately and viscerally. Let's return one final time to money, because there's a specific comparison worth making explicit that helps anchor everything we've discussed across this long evening. What Margaret's household actually looked like set directly against households at the very bottom of London's economic scale, living at the same historical moment, often only a few streets away. We've already noted that a skilled factory worker in 1881 might earn somewhere between £50 and £70 a year, a figure that already sits close to what the Whitfields spend on Margaret's wardrobe alone in a single year. But London in this period also contained an enormous population of unskilled and casual laborers, dock workers, seamstresses, street sellers, whose earnings sat considerably lower still, sometimes as little as £25 to £40 a year for a full-time working adult, and often considerably less reliable for casual or seasonal labor. A skilled seamstress working from home on piecework, producing exactly the kind of fine needlework that trims Margaret's dresses, might earn as little as £10 to £15 a year, working brutally long hours in poor light for wages that left essentially no margin at all against illness, unemployment, or any unexpected expense. Charles Booth, a researcher who would begin his enormous, detailed survey of London poverty just a few years after the evening we've spent with Margaret, would eventually document, street by street, exactly how close large portions of London's population lived to genuine destitution even while fully employed. A level of documented, granular poverty research that didn't yet exist in 1881. But that was investigating conditions already fully present in the city Margaret's carriage rides through on her way to Madame Ceylan's, conditions she would have been dimly, generally aware of without ever encountering them directly in her own daily rounds. This is worth stating plainly rather than leaving as subtext. The entire elaborate structure we've spent this whole evening documenting, the 13 pounds of engineered clothing, the 6-servant household, the dress fittings and morning calls and formal dinners, existed within a city where a very large proportion of the population lived on an annual income smaller than what Margaret's household spent on flowers and stationery alone. Margaret's own charity work, which we discussed at length in Part 5, brought her into direct, if carefully managed and time-limited, contact with exactly this reality. The impoverished gentlewomen her committee assisted were themselves, in most cases, considerably better off than London's working poor more broadly, precisely because they had once occupied a social position adjacent to Margaret's own, and retained some of its social capital even after losing its financial underpinning. The invisible labor we've spent this whole night carefully documenting, and in its own way, defending, the genuine skill and effort behind Margaret's household management, her social diplomacy, her charitable administration is real, and worth taking seriously on its own terms. It is also, inescapably, labor performed inside a structure of extraordinary privilege, resting on an economic foundation that a very large number of Margaret's contemporaries, working equally hard or harder, could never hope to access. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. A version of exactly the balanced, double-sided understanding we tried to hold throughout this whole evening's account of Margaret's life. The real skill and the real constraint, the genuine competence and the genuine injustice, sitting side by side without either one erasing the other. Let's spend a little time now on Margaret's own mother, since the contrast between one Victorian generation and the next tells us something the single day we've followed cannot show on its own. Margaret's mother, whom we'll call Mrs. Ellison, was born in 1828, married in 1849, and so lived through the earlier, somewhat less rigidly codified version of upper-middle-class womanhood that predates most of what we've described tonight. When Mrs. Ellison was Margaret's age, the crinoline had not yet arrived. The calling card system, while already established, had not yet calcified into the precise 15 to 25-minute choreography Margaret performs almost unconsciously. Isabella Beeton's book of household management, which would eventually sit on Margaret's own kitchen shelf, had not yet been written. Mrs. Ellison learned household management from her own mother directly, through observation and apprenticeship, rather than through the codified, published system of rules Margaret absorbed partly from her mother, and partly from the printed advice literature that exploded across the 1850s and 1860s. Mrs. Ellison's own girlhood, in turn, sat closer to the world of Jane Austen's novels than to the world Margaret inhabits, a quieter, more locally contained social life, less obsessively organized around a formal London season, in a family of comfortable but genuinely modest means compared to the household Margaret now runs. The gap between Mrs. Ellison's girlhood and Margaret's own life in 1881 is, in other words, considerable, not simply a difference in fashion, but a difference in the entire scale and formality of the social machinery a woman of the professional upper-middle class was expected to operate. And yet the underlying shape, generation to generation, holds remarkably constant. Mrs. Ellison managed her own household with exactly the same kind of invisible, uncredited competence we've spent tonight documenting in Margaret. She raised Margaret specifically to inherit that competence, drilling her, from an early age, in exactly the skills of correspondence, household accounts, the reading of a room, the management of servants that fill Margaret's own days now. When Margaret visits her mother, now widowed and living quietly in Bath, the two women fall into a particular kind of shorthand conversation about household matters that Charles, listening from across the room, only half follows. Two women speaking a shared professional language neither one has ever had occasion to name as such. This continuity matters because it's easy, focusing so closely on one day in one woman's life, to imagine the pattern we've described as somehow unique to Margaret's specific moment. It isn't. It is instead one snapshot within a much longer chain, stretching back through Mrs. Ellison's own girlhood and forward, we already know, into whatever version of this life Alice will eventually inherit or, perhaps, partially escape. Let's close now, properly, returning one final time to the sleeping house we left at the end of Part 8, but standing back a little further this time, taking in the whole shape of what we've spent this entire long evening examining. We began with a portrait, the fiction of the silk-dressed woman gazing decoratively out a rain-streaked window, still, ornamental, essentially passive. Everything we've walked through since has been an argument, gathered patiently across one long fictional day, and the wider historical record surrounding it, against that portrait's basic premise. Margaret's day, from 6:20 in the morning until midnight, midnight, contained almost no genuinely unclaimed time. It contained the physical labor of 13 pounds of engineered clothing worn from dawn past midnight, the administrative labor of a 6-person household run with real, if entirely uncredited, executive skill, the diplomatic labor of morning calls and dinner-table conversation, each one a small, precisely calibrated performance whose success depended on the effort behind it remaining completely invisible. The financial labor of accounts kept and allowances stretched against a household budget with real, if comfortable, limits, and running underneath all of it, a private intellectual life. Middlemark reread at 29 with fresh eyes, a considered private opinion on Cambridge examination results, a quiet unspoken interest in what her own daughter's life might eventually look like, that had, in 1881, essentially nowhere formal to go. None of this erases the real privilege sitting underneath Margaret's life, a privilege we tried to hold honestly alongside everything else in Part 22. A privilege built on a class and economic structure that left the majority of Victorian London working equally hard, without anything close to Margaret's comfort or security. Both things are true at once, and holding them together, rather than collapsing the story into either simple celebration or simple condemnation, is the only way to actually see Margaret clearly rather than through a single flattening lens. What Margaret represents in the end is not the exception, not Florence Nightingale or George Eliot or Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the handful of women whose names survived because they found some way through or around the structure entirely. Margaret is the far larger, far quieter norm. An intelligent, genuinely capable woman who spent her considerable skill on the only work her world offered her, did that work extremely well, received no formal credit for any of it, and carried, alongside real satisfaction and real partnership and real pleasure, a private awareness, visible in a half hour with a novel, in a considered opinion never quite voiced loudly enough, in a watchful curiosity about her own daughter's future. That the container she lived inside was narrower than the mind living inside it. It is nearly 1 in the morning now, in the story and in whatever hour has passed for you listening to it. The gas lamp on Margaret's corner is still burning low. The fog outside has settled into the particular stillness London keeps in its last hours before the milk carts and the first servants stir. Upstairs, Margaret is asleep, hair braided, notebook closed downstairs with tomorrow's 3 items already written in her own steady hand. In a few hours the whole pattern will begin again, different letters, a different caller, perhaps another small crisis absorbed quietly before anyone upstairs even notices, the same shape, endlessly renewed, invisible and real. Thank you for spending these hours with Margaret and with the world she moved through. If tonight helped you drift off, or simply gave you something quiet to sit with, that's exactly what this was for. Rest well, my friend. We've been somewhere real tonight.